Hello and welcome. I'm Nadira Tudor and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Trump names vaccine skeptic Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as his pick for health secretary. Russia targets the city of Odessa, killing one, injuring others and leaving thousands without heating after missiles hit pipelines. And the slap shown around the world. Iron Mike Tyson prepares for battle against Jake Paul in one of the most anticipated fights in boxing history. US President-elect Donald Trump's nominations for top government jobs are continuing to raise eyebrows in political and expert circles. There's been a flurry of announcements in recent days, but some of the people picked seemed incongruous with the job they'll be doing once Trump returns to the White House. Nick Harper has more from Washington.
A pro-oil and gas guy to protect America's wildlife, a vaccine skeptic to head up America's health agency, and someone under investigation to lead the Justice Department. They're the latest on the roster to fill up Donald Trump's cabinet. The president-elect held a gala at his Mar-a-Lago residence in Florida on Thursday night, where he praised his picks and championed their abilities.
He's going to head the Department of Interior, and he's going to be fantastic. Good, Doug.
North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum has been nominated for Interior Secretary.
To unlock the best of America, we need a leader who's clearly focused on three things: economy, energy, and national security.
He'll be tasked with Trump's plan to increase domestic oil and gas production on federal lands, likely helped by his long-standing ties to fossil fuel companies. Former presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has been chosen to lead the Department of Health and Human Services. He's previously pushed health-related conspiracy theories online and amplified debunked claims that vaccines cause autism.
And he's going to help make America healthy again.
He lied to investigators.
And there's continued consternation, even from within Trump's own party, about his pick for Attorney General, Matt Gaetz. The Florida congressman is facing a probe into alleged sexual misconduct and illicit drug use.
What we've seen with Trump's picks this time around is a really consistent pattern, and that's been he's going with people that he knows well. What Trump is trying to do here basically is build a circle of trust where he can count on his people in these various roles across the administration to execute his policies the way that he wants it done.
Despite the skepticism, these nominees could be fast-tracked into position. Trump is pushing to shortcut the process by using so-called recess appointments. That would allow him to rubber stamp his own choices and avoid the potentially timely confirmation process and the possible rejection of his nominations. Nick Harper, Al Arabiya News, Washington.
For more on this, I'm joined from Washington by our chief correspondent, Simon Mark. Simon, each day is another day for a Trump revelation, and today is no exception. Can RFK Jr. help make America healthy again?
Well, Donald Trump is certainly banking on that. RFK Jr. is securing his reward for having assisted Donald Trump in his election victory. Remember that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. started out running as a presidential candidate for the Democrats. He got nowhere there because, of course, there was no real opportunity for him in the primary campaign against President Joe Biden to notch up any wins. He went on to become an independent, a sort of a third party candidate for the presidency. That wasn't going anywhere, so he threw his towel in and instead threw his hat into Donald Trump's ring and eventually endorsed Donald Trump, campaigning with him in the final weeks of the campaign. And he's clearly got Donald Trump's ear because the president-elect says that his goal is to make America healthy again. But this appointment has sent shivers through the corridors of America's public health agencies, including the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control, and all of the others, because RFK Jr. has views that are absolutely toxic as far as America's public health orthodoxy is concerned. He's a vaccine skeptic. He doesn't believe that fluoride should remain in the public water systems. He claimed that COVID-19 was specifically engineered so that it would not be so that neither Chinese nationals nor Jewish people would fall victim to the pandemic. And he's also got plans for regulations within the pharmaceutical industry and even within the nutrition industry that fly in the face of Donald Trump's insistence that he also wants simultaneously to bring about less government in the lives of people, a smaller government, a government that will save $2 trillion by cutting regulations. So in that regard, they may be on a bit of a collision course. But the biggest challenge they've got right now is to get Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and some of these other appointees confirmed by the Senate, although certainly Republicans in the Senate last night were all indicating that they'll give him a look.
Simon, it is a bit baffling, isn't it? He's certainly gone around the houses. You mentioned Democrat, Independent, and now Donald Trump's suggestion here. And it is a bit of a baffling thing to think that he will get through the Senate and get through. So why on earth would Trump choose him?
Because this is all about Donald Trump doing exactly what he pledged to do on the campaign trail. Everything that we've witnessed here over the last week is Donald Trump saying that Trump 2.0 is going to be completely different than his first term in office. He's not going to find common cause with experts and specialists. He's not going to sit down in a room and start negotiating with Dr. Anthony Fauci at the National Institutes of Health, now retired, of course, and experts like that. He wants to create a government of radicals. And what he's doing with all of these picks is throwing the gauntlet down for Republicans on Capitol Hill and saying, look, I got a huge mandate from the American people. The entire House of Representatives, of course, was up for grabs in the election. He can say to all the Republicans in the House, you owe your positions to my coattails. A third of the Senate was up for grabs. He can say to those Republicans who find themselves either returning to the Senate or arriving for the first time again, it was my coattails that got you here. So this is all a challenge to Republicans on Capitol Hill. He's saying to them, how far are you going to let me go? Are you going to let me do everything I want to do, or are you going to find a way of constraining me? Just before we came on air, we got news that the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mike Johnson, a Republican, is now saying that he does not believe the House Ethics Committee report into the conduct of Matt Gaetz, the nominee for the position of Attorney General, should be released to the public now that Matt Gaetz has resigned his position in the House of Representatives. That is a huge assist for Donald Trump coming from the Speaker of the House, because if that report goes public, it may well torpedo Matt Gaetz's chances of becoming Attorney General. So the indications for Donald Trump are that, having thrown the gauntlet down, many Republicans are preparing to line up right behind him.
Well, Simon, thanks for following every twist and turn on this, and I'm sure we'll be speaking to you in the coming days. Thank you, Simon Marks in Washington. Now, during last night's speech, Trump told supporters the Russia-Ukraine conflict has got to stop. It comes as Russia attacks the city of Odessa with drones and missiles targeting a residential area, which killed one woman and left at least 10 people injured, including a 9-year-old boy. The strike also hit the city's pipelines, leaving many without buildings without heating. Now, for more on this, I'm joined by our Kyiv correspondent, Megumi Lim. Megumi, why is Odessa significant for Russia? Why has it come under frequent attacks?
Well, first of all, as you said, very devastating attacks overnight against Odessa last night. Ukraine's Air Force said that its air defenses shot down 25 out of 29 drones and also 1 out of 2 missiles launched by Russia that injured 10 people, at least 10 people, and killed 1 woman. And, you know, Odessa is significant for Russia. It has been coming under frequent attacks since Russia's or throughout Russia's full-scale invasion. Now, why is that? Well, Odessa is home to the biggest port in Ukraine, and this port is considered one of the largest in the Black Sea basin. So clearly, Odessa is a strategically important city for Ukraine and therefore for Russia as a target. And so throughout the war, Russia has targeted and attacked Odessa's grain storage warehouses. It has attacked its port facilities and also the civilian cargo vessels that have been using the Black Sea route to get to the ports in Odessa. Now, the aim clearly for Russia is to try to cripple Ukraine's economy. This Black Sea route has been and is vital for Ukraine's agricultural exports. And as we know, Ukraine is called the breadbasket of Europe. But not only that, Ukraine is also a major food supplier to countries in the global south. So these attacks that Russia has carried out throughout the war has really raised concerns about global food security. And it is clear that this war is not just about the trenches, but it is indeed a multi-pronged effort by Russia to try to destroy Ukraine.
Yeah, it does seem that way at the moment. Now, what we do know, we mentioned the pipelines. Winter is setting in, and Ukrainian officials are saying Russia will continue to ramp up attacks. So how will people cope?
Well, people are gearing up for probably the most difficult winter of war. More than half of Ukraine's energy generating capacity has been damaged and crippled by Russian attacks that were carried out this summer against Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Now, President Zelensky has already warned that this winter is going to be particularly dangerous, and he has been urging Ukraine's partners to provide more air defense systems to prevent further attacks on Ukraine's energy grid. But officials here have been saying that these attacks will continue. Russia will continue to intensify these attacks and target Ukraine's energy infrastructure. And energy officials have said that if these attacks do continue, we can expect blackouts of up to 20 hours a day. This is the worst case scenario that officials here have described. But even in a sort of better scenario, they're saying that blackouts will still last for as long as 8 hours. And so this is really going to be a very difficult winter ahead, and these possible scenarios will still play out even with help from the EU. The EU has already pledged 160 million euros to help Ukraine repair its energy grid, and also for humanitarian aid, things like providing shelter and also heaters to people here. And the EU has also said that it plans to export 2 gigawatts of electricity to Ukraine. This will make up about 12% of Ukraine's winter needs. But again, this is not going to be enough. We will be facing long blackouts this winter. So we will be seeing a lot of suffering here in Ukraine during the winter months.
Megumi, if we look at, 20 hours of blackouts being a worst-case scenario, what we do know is Zelensky is developing his 10-point internal resilience plan. What more can you tell us about that?
That's right. President Zelensky, in his nightly video address on Thursday last night, said that this internal resilience plan will be unveiled next week. We do not know exactly what's in it yet, but late last month, he did instruct the National Security Defense Council to prepare a plan to strengthen Ukraine, to basically bolster its front lines, to bolster its military-industrial complex, and also to bolster its economic and financial sector, among other strategic sectors in the country. Zelensky is likely preparing, as you said, for the upcoming difficult winter months, but also for a Trump presidency. There's a lot of uncertainty as to whether Trump will force Ukraine and Russia into some kind of a negotiated settlement where Ukraine may have to cede some territory to Russia. And so Zelensky, he has already announced his victory plan, as we know, which has elements that is directed at Kyiv's allies as to what Ukraine needs to gain a sort of upper hand in this war. But this victory plan did receive some criticism domestically, and people here were saying that Zelensky also needs to address issues that can be solved internally. There needs to be internal solutions as well, and it is unclear whether this 10-point internal resilience plan was structured in response to that. But we will be seeing internal solutions to issues that Ukraine is facing within this plan. But we will find out more next week.
Megumi Lim in Kyiv, thank you very much for the update. Let's have a look at some other stories making the news around the world. An open letter to the United Nations has said climate change talks are no longer fit for purpose and should only be hosted by countries who are attempting to give up fossil fuels. The letter, signed by UN Chief Ban Ki-moon, was disclosed during the COP29 climate summit currently taking place in Baku in Azerbaijan. President Anura Kumara Dissanayake has won the country's general election with a landslide victory. During his campaign, he promised to help the island recover from financial concerns. At least 10 people have died after a fire ripped through a retirement home in northern Spain earlier today. 2 people remain in a critical condition after the incident at the Jardin de Villafranca in the town Villafranca de Ebro in Zaragoza. And New York will become the first city in the United States to introduce a congestion charge in January. Governor Kathy Hochul said the decision would unclog the streets, reduce pollution and deliver better public transit for millions of New Yorkers. The programme has faced criticism from incoming President Donald Trump. There are reports that the US ambassador to Lebanon has submitted a draft ceasefire proposal to the Speaker of the country's parliament. It comes as the World Bank confirms the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah has caused $8.5 billion in damage and losses to Lebanon, with figures expected to rise as the conflict continues. For more on this, I'm joined from our correspondent Giles Gibson in Tel Aviv. Giles, let's start by unpacking the latest on this. What do we know about the alleged draft truce proposal?
Well, there are multiple reports that it's going to be a 60-day ceasefire, sticking to the parameters of UN Resolution 1701, which dates back to 2006. What that means in practice is that Hezbollah fighters would have to withdraw behind the Litani River in southern Lebanon. And then really the big question about this potential deal is what it would mean for Israeli forces in southern Lebanon. Would they have to completely withdraw back into northern Israel, or would they have some sort of freedom? That's the word that's being used in these reports, freedom to cross back into Lebanon if they feel that the terms of this potential ceasefire deal are being violated by the other side.
A senior Hamas official has said the Palestinian militant group is ready for a ceasefire in Gaza and urged US President-elect Donald Trump to pressure Israel to end the aggression. How have the Israeli government reacted to this?
Well, what we're hearing from senior Israeli ministers is that they feel that they're getting much closer to a ceasefire deal in Lebanon, but really we are not hearing anything about any movement towards an end to the conflict in Gaza. You have the foreign minister, Gideon Saar, saying that he told the French foreign minister who was visiting this week that there was progress towards this deal in terms of the conflict in Lebanon. The energy minister, Eli Cohen, saying that really we are closer than ever before war, since the start of the conflict in the south of Lebanon, to some sort of a ceasefire deal, but absolutely no mention of any sort of a deal taking shape in relation to the conflict in Gaza. And, of course, every single day that ticks by, the humanitarian situation there is just getting that little bit worse every time.
Giles, that's quite a statement, closer than ever before, but it's still quite open-ended, isn't it? And very optimistic, given that we need to look at the challenges. How will the deal be met with the continuous bombardment on Lebanon? We know that Israel stepped up its offensive late September, and last Friday an Israeli airstrike flattened a building near one of Beirut's busiest traffic junctions. Surely this is going to make it very difficult for diplomatic efforts to be negotiated by the US.
Yeah, those airstrikes are continuing, and also we are hearing from the Israeli military that they are actually penetrating into areas of southern Lebanon, villages that they have not been to before so far during this ground offensive. That is coming at a cost to Israeli soldiers' lives. The Israeli military saying that 6 soldiers were killed on Wednesday, one of the bloodiest days of the offensive so far in terms of the Israeli side, and 1 soldier also killed on Thursday. The theory really is that the Israeli military are pushing deeper into southern Lebanon to try to force Hezbollah's hand, to try to make them come to the table and agree to a deal along the lines of the deal that we were just discussing. But in the meantime, you still have those airstrikes hitting Beirut and other parts of Lebanon, and rockets still coming in the opposite direction, fired by Hezbollah into northern and other parts of Israel.
We can have hopes and fears, though. You know, both things are relevant here in this discussion, because the draft truce proposal has been submitted, according to an advisor to the Speaker of the Lebanese government, and an answer is expected over the next 72 hours or next week. So can we be hopeful?
Well, I think one of the signs that we are approaching some sort of a deal, some sort of a breakthrough, is that the external players in all of this are also showing signs that they're trying to push it along. So you have reports that President-elect Donald Trump over in the US signed off on a deal that was sketched out to him by an Israeli government minister. You have Ali Lajani, who is an advisor to Iran's supreme leader, going to Beirut this week for talks, saying that the Iranians would back any sort of an agreement that the Lebanese government is prepared to sign up to, and also signs that Russia could potentially have a role in this ceasefire deal. Reports that Russia could be involved in terms of using its forces in Syria to stop weapons moving from that country into Lebanon and then potentially passing into the hands of Hezbollah militants.
Giles Gibson in Tel Aviv, thank you very much for the updates. Thank you. Let's have a look now at the top business news. Britain's economy has slowed down significantly in the third quarter of this year, a huge setback to Chancellor Rachel Reeves, who recently unveiled the country's budget. UK's GDP grew by only 0.1% during September as manufacturing and construction dropped. Consumer goods from Unilever, which is responsible for brands like Ben & Jerry's and Magnum, has revealed it will be cutting less jobs in Europe than originally anticipated as it looks to hire 1,000 people. Earlier this year, the company claimed it would axe 7,500 jobs across the globe to save around $845 million. Turning to sport now, and England will take on South Africa at Twickenham Stadium tomorrow as the Springboks look for another victory after beating Scotland last week. And Australian tennis star Nick Kyrgios has revealed he feels fit and healthy as he prepares to return to court for the Brisbane International in December. The 29-year-old has been out with knee, foot and wrist injuries for the last 2 years. But the sports story everyone is talking about today is the much-anticipated fight between social media star Jake Paul and legendary boxer Mike Tyson. Paul and Tyson met for their weigh-in last night, with Iron Mike slapping his opponent on stage. The two will face off at the Dallas Cowboys football stadium tonight in front of 70,000 fans, and the fight will be aired on Netflix.
All right, that's it. That's it for Mike Tyson.
So who will come out victorious? Well, for more on this, I'm joined from Texas by Gareth A. Davies, the boxing columnist from the Daily Telegraph. Gareth.
How are you?
I'm all right, thanks. It does look quite stressful, this fight. It's the first for Mike Tyson in 19 years. Does he stand a good chance against someone 30 years younger?
Well, that's the jeopardy, Nadira, in this contest. A lot of excitement here this week in Dallas, Texas. Like you say 70,000. They may even get up to 90,000 fans in the arena tonight, and it may break all records for a live broadcast on a sporting event. It's 22 million is the record for a Super Bowl playoff game, but it's on Netflix, it's free, it's trending for over 25 million viewers, which they think will go up to 50 million when it stays on the platform. The reason: Jake Paul's a massive marketeer, a young genius in the influencer sphere who's taken to boxing. He's got 25 million subscribers himself. And then you've got Iron Mike Tyson, one of the most fascinating human beings on the planet, from my milieu, from the fight world, who's rolling back the years. It's nostalgia linked with bizarre carnival stuff. I think it's a big story because Mike Tyson is 58. He was the youngest heavyweight champion in history, remember, at the age of just 20. So people wonder whether tonight, can he really roll back the years, bring darkness again for one more time, as I asked him earlier on this week in an intimate interview with him. And he said, yes, I can. I'm bringing the devil himself in the ring. And he showed it with that slap to test Jake Paul's reflexes yesterday at those weigh-ins, as you rightly mentioned. It's a big event. Most people are feeling the nostalgia, Nadira, for Mike Tyson, and they want him to knock Jake Paul out. But I'm giving him 1 or 2 rounds to do it before the 58-year-old gets exhausted.
The figures you're quoting are absolutely incredible. The power of technology these days, 25 million is just one of the figures you quoted. And the word nostalgia, I'm not quite sure about that. I can think of better ways of reminiscing, but it is going to be massive. How does the world of boxing view this matchup, a YouTuber versus a 58-year-old former world champion?
Well, it's the name Mike Tyson. The boxing purists feel that there's a danger of him, if he gets beaten by Jake Paul, of ruining his legacy. I mean, his legacy in the heavyweight division is extraordinary. It's the youngest champion ever. All the kind of divisiveness around him early in his life as a wrecking ball, as both a fighter and even as a human being. So many things going up and down his life, spilling and losing $250 million that he earned, that he was almost destitute at the end of it. The story of rising from privation in Brownsville, New York. He's a changed man, by the way, and I've been friends with Mike for many years, and he's an extraordinary human being. It's amazing that he's even around, given the ravages of what happened in his early life. But I think there's that fascination about, can this man who was like a physical freak, he's not a big guy, but he was knocking out the super heavy guys in his era, can he actually do it one more time? The numbers are enormous because these are 2 huge marketing forces coming together. Honestly, my straw poll of being around Dallas and meeting all the fans who are coming into town is so many people want to see Iron Mike back again because he's so beloved now. It's extraordinary that he's still here. And Jake Paul has played the villain and played the heel really cleverly. Even in the Toyota Music Factory, where we've all had all the events, the set pieces during the week, there's even a punch ball that's the face of Jake Paul that you can go and punch. It's all marketing. It's all a bit of fun, but we also have to remember that boxing is an inherently dangerous sport, and we hope nothing goes wrong tonight. They're fighting over 8 2-minute rounds, and of course there's an enormous women's fight on the card. Amanda Serrano, the Puerto Rican with 7 world titles, against the Irish woman Katie Taylor, 2 modern icons in women's boxing.
The canny, can't-he question, 2 worlds colliding. It is incredible. It's going to be very exciting. There's no doubt about it. And we've been seeing the footage with the slap during what happened last night. What did you make of that slap?
Well, as I say, I think what Mike did was, Mike wasn't wearing shoes and Jake crawled in, stepped on his toe. I don't know if it was deliberate or not, but Mike reacted straight away, slapped Jake Paul's face with the right hand. Jake Paul didn't even react. His hands didn't come up. And I think Mike Tyson, in his mind, the animal spirit coming into him, will be saying, right, he doesn't have fast reactions. I've got faster hands than his. But he will have faster hands, as I say, for the first 2 or maybe 3 rounds. They both weighed 227, 228 pounds, 16 stone 3. They're very equal in weight. Mike Tyson should know his way around the fight early on. He'll be dangerous for 2 or 3 rounds and may knock Jake Paul out. That's the plan, he's told me. But the longer the fight goes, the more chance there is for the younger man to take the bout on points with an exhausted Mike Tyson.
Gareth, I'm going to ask you for one name, the burning question, and if you were a betting person, who's going to win?
I've got to sit on the fence. Tyson early, Paul late.
There were 2 there. There were 2 there. Gareth A. Davies from the Telegraph. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thanks.
Let's remind you of our top stories. Trump names vaccine skeptic Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as his pick for health secretary. Russia targets the city of Odessa, killing 1, injuring others and leaving thousands without heating after missiles hit pipelines. And the slap shown around the world. Iron Mike Tyson prepares for battle against Jake Paul in one of the most anticipated fights in boxing history. That's it from us tonight. Thanks for joining us on W News. Tom Burges Watson is up later with GNT. Good night.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello, I'm Riz Khan. Welcome to a special edition of the show from Washington, D.C. In this episode, Donald Trump's campaign spokesman gives us a vision of how the president-elect and his party will govern the nation.
No one's landed from Mars and taken over the White House or the Congress. This is a mirror of the American people.
From Egypt to Austria, Colombia to Kazakhstan, Washington visitors help Donald Trump with his tier list. We'll hear how the mainstream and digital media covered and influenced the election. And as America looks to heal divisions, we'll bring you election reflections in poetic form.
And the sun still shines on the Capitol pool, glinting eyes squinting like some precious jewel. The ripples now calming, disarming some fears of the journey ahead to the forthcoming years. The tsunami receding, for now, it appears.
Adolfo Franco is a former advisor to the Republican presidential nominee John McCain and a spokesman for the Trump 2024 campaign. He's a Cuban-American political advisor who knows his way around the corridors of power in Washington. He expects the president-elect to follow through with plans for a reckoning with politicized officials in the city, but a toning down in political rhetoric. And he considers the election result to be a generational realignment of American voters. Mr. Franco, thanks for giving us some time here.
Delighted.
Now, I met someone who was with Steve Bannon on the night of the election, and he said he realized that it was a Donald Trump victory when word came in from the Latino vote in Florida. What was that extraordinary night like for you?
Well, it was extraordinary, particularly on the Latino vote. This is the first time since the 1980s that a Republican has carried Dade County. Dade County is a county where there's a very, very large Latino population by 10 points. So it was remarkable. And 55% of Latino men. These numbers are unprecedented in modern times. And this is despite the rhetoric against President Trump that was launched with that ill-fated Puerto Rican joke and the rest of it. And it reflects something. Latino voters are no different than any other American. They're concerned about bread and butter issues. They're concerned about security. They're concerned about the border. And that is why I think the lesson of this election is identity politics in America is dying quickly.
So what do you regard as the most significant aspect of what's become an historic comeback?
Well, I think the most significant aspect is that despite lawfare that was launched against President Trump, or persecution, political persecution against President Trump, doing everything to deny the American people the right to vote for President Trump, there was a realization, and it was a simple question that Ronald Reagan asked many, many years ago, and President Trump asked the same question. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? And that is really the decisive reason that the president won the election. It has nothing to do with identity politics. It has nothing really to do with abortion. It has nothing to do with this idea of democracy and the rest of it. It was a question of the American people getting a right to see an agenda that really addresses their day-to-day needs. And that's why the president won.
I'll touch on some of the policies and the prospects in a moment, but I wonder, was this a generational vote, something that might realign support for the Republican Party for years to come?
Well, that's an excellent question, because there's a tendency in our studies of voters that when they vote a certain way initially in their lives, they tend to repeat that. It's a formation point. And the inroads that we made with young voters were remarkable in terms of what the president did. So now if the president delivers, which I think he will in the next 4 years, I think it is generational. I think it is a decisive moment for the Republican Party, and it is for this reason. It has broadened the Republican Party in a way that no other Republican in modern time has done.
So you referred to the Latino vote. Now, both the Arab American and the Latino votes seem to have played such a significant role in this election. What is it, do you think, that has encouraged these voters to switch their allegiance from the Democrats to the Republicans over the past 8 years?
Well, I think the Arab American vote is a little bit different. For example, in Dearborn, in Michigan, where there's a very large concentration, the largest of Arab Americans in the United States, 19% of Arab Americans voted for Jill Stein as an alternative. They weren't necessarily voting for President Trump. This, of course, has to do with the situation in Gaza and Israel, which is of great concern to many Arab Americans. So I think that is a little bit different. However, many Arab Americans as Latino voters, again, they're making the decisions. They're just like any other Americans. What I think has been a huge mistake for the Democratic Party, and it's been coming for many years, is what we call identity politics. And that is to silo voters to say, well, if you're a Latino, you need to vote on these particular issues. If you're Arab American, on these particular issues. At the end of the day, I think voters are looking at policies holistically. And that's what this election's results demonstrated.
I'll touch on that again in a moment, but I wonder, with a clean sweep of the presidency and both houses of Congress, effectively, Donald Trump has a very powerful mandate, almost a free hand, to do what he wants to. He's got a mandate from the people now. How do you think he will use that? How can he use that power he now has?
Well, I think he will move very, very quickly, because most business gets done in the first 2 years of a presidency. I think he'll move very quickly in Congress to do tax and regulatory reforms, particularly extending the tax cuts, which is the domestic issue in this country, that are set. His tax policies that were set in place 10 years ago expire next year. That's the success that Biden has had as been a consequence, ironically, of the Trump policies of 2017, because they've been in place all of these years, but they're set to expire. That requires just a simple majority in Congress, which he will have. And I think that will be the #1 congressional priority. On his executive powers, which he has broad executive powers, I think you'll see very swift action on the border, on border security with executive orders. There'll be a Remain in Mexico policy, what we call a catch and release in this country of illegal immigrants, will stop immediately, and you'll see those things happen quickly. You'll see a reversal on energy policy through regulation. You'll see actions on tariffs very, very swiftly as well. So when you see the president's first days, they will be a slew of executive orders, reversing the previous administration's policies and setting in place new policies. He is I know him. He is extremely mindful of the need to deliver as quickly as possible for the American people on reducing inflation and getting crime and illegal immigration under control.
Considering the divisive nature between the parties, how much is the reversal of some policies from the Biden administration really a bit of kind of just revenge?
Well, I don't think it is revenge. I think there are significant differences on policy on the big issues in this country that have to do with, again, immigration, have to do with government spending, which I think it will rein in now with Elon Musk being tasked to look at the size of government. I don't think it will be a revenge. This was an election, and I think I agree with the Democrats on this, an election about the kind of country we envision and the kind of country we will be. And as a consequence of that, I don't think there'll be revengeful policies. They're just different perspectives of what the role of American government should be. And that he needs to deliver on very quickly.
Although President Trump has said that his framework for his administration is promises made, promises kept. And he has said that there will be some people who pay for certain things. Now, should people be reassured or worried about his framework?
I don't think they should be worried for this reason. His son just spoke 2 days ago, Donald Trump Jr., and he said this idea of persecuting the Clintons or the Bidens and Hunter Biden and so forth, these are Donald Trump Jr.'s words. This is nonsense. We didn't do it with Hillary Clinton when there was a famous phrase in this country, 2016, of lock her up, and the Justice Department said she violated the law regarding security issues. There was no prosecution of Hillary Clinton, and I do not envision a prosecution of the Biden family. And that is going to be the difference. I think when he means about revenge, he will clean up the Justice Department, because I think entrenched bureaucrats in this country do have a political agenda.
One promise Donald Trump made was to be a dictator on day one. Now, was that simply a bit of winding up his opponents, or do we expect a flurry of executive orders with that famous signature on them?
Well, you know, when he made that, I wish people would actually look at the clip, because he's also joking and laughing. And he says, this is a phrase I'm using. What he meant by dictator on day one is he will take swift action. He was referring to two particular issues. He was referring to border security and sealing the border, which he has the authority to do very quickly. And the other was on tariffs. So I think you'll see the president move on those as quote unquote dictator, meaning he will take unilateral action, but he has the authority to do that. But Donald Trump is not a scripted politician. Donald Trump jokes. Donald Trump says things the way everyday people speak when they're at restaurants and over meals and the rest of it. He's not reading a speech the way most politicians do. And people take those things out of context as though those are polished or pronouncement. That's just his style.
The danger is, in politics, things do stick. Nothing ever disappears anymore. So when you have someone as volatile as Donald Trump, when it comes to the statements he makes, some of those could stick, and people will take them seriously.
Yes, but I think this election tells you the American people know Donald Trump. This is not new. But they knew him before he was elected president in 2016. But to say that Donald Trump says things that are sometimes colorful, to use that term, or that you say stick, the American people now returned him as president of the United States with an electoral, I think, margin that no one expected, and the popular vote. President Trump received more votes than he did in 2016. There's one thing I can say to your viewers is the American people know who Donald Trump is. So they knew who Donald Trump was in 2016. They had 4 years of Donald Trump, and they decided this is the man to lead the country.
Well, Mr. Franco, you know Donald Trump well, of course. So I wonder, I heard someone say even Donald Trump was surprised by the landslide, victory he got. Was that the case?
I think that's partially true. And I was surprised a bit. But something President Trump said actually the day of the election before the results were in, he said either it'll be very close or it won't be. And we'll win by a large number. And what he means is there's a tendency in the country that a trend happens, and that's what happens. The country things tend to break in one or the other candidate's way. And as you know, all of the swing states voted for Donald Trump, all of them, in their totality. So it was either going to be a very close election, depending on turnout, or it was going to be decisive. And what happened was more people actually turned out for President Trump than we expected. and fewer people turned out for the other candidate than was expected. Had everyone turned out, if you will, as projected, it would have been a much closer race. So it was ultimately what we call a ground game, and that ground game favored President Trump, and that's why the margin was what it was.
I have to say, returning to Washington, D.C., it was a bit disconcerting to see the fences around the White House and shops boarded up, expecting trouble. Now, there are those who say it's because of the huge margin of victory that perhaps trouble was avoided. But would you have anticipated things to go badly wrong on the streets had it not been that way?
I think things would have gone badly on the street. This is a Democratic city. I can't imagine there are many Trump supporters in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, nor would they easily travel to this area. The neighboring communities that were called bedroom communities in the neighboring states are also heavily Democratic. So if there would have been any problem here, it would have been from the left, from Intifada and the rest of it. I think possibly there would have been trouble had President Trump, for example, declared victory while the other candidate was ahead or was declared the victor. But the decisive nature of this election reflected no violence, because I don't think anybody that I know of is calling into question that President Trump didn't win this fairly.
Now, Donald Trump distanced himself from Project 2025 during the campaign, and you've seen that 1,000-page document. Are there aspects of it you would like to see and expect to see in the future policy under Donald Trump's presidency?
I certainly do, and I think President Trump does as well. To be clear about Project 2025, there are aspects or items in that 1,000-page document that President Trump does not agree with. But many of them, I think most of them, he does agree with. But he wasn't the architect of it. He didn't direct it. And I want to clarify something. The Heritage Foundation, which is the institution that authored that document, by law is prohibited from working with a presidential candidate. It's a nonpartisan organization on formulating the document. The fact of the matter is it's conservative, and it does reflect the views of most Republicans, does reflect the views of Donald Trump in large. But they have been cherry-picked some items that we don't agree with, or he doesn't agree with. And that's what was used politically.
Also, there are people who believe that Donald Trump will focus on the areas of government that he cares the most about: justice, defense, national security, intelligence services, and economic matters, and then delegate decision-making to others. How engaged do you expect Donald Trump to be overall?
Well, I think he's going to be engaged the way President Reagan was engaged. President Reagan is considered one of our most successful presidents. Certainly Republicans revere him. And President Reagan famously said, "I surround myself with the best people possible and delegate the responsibilities of running a multi-million person government to them." He can't micromanage the government even if he wanted to. So I think it's important to set the broad policy objectives and give it to the best people who are loyal to you. And that's what he will do. He has a huge advantage this go round. He's done it for 4 years. He's learned what works, what doesn't work. He's learned who to rely on, who to listen to. So he will have a huge advantage as compared to 2017 when he assumed power, but in which he was a very successful president, I think, for 4 years. So I envision a more successful presidency this go round.
That last term was also kind of marred with some very negative departures and comments going back and forth as well. There are those who say perhaps he knows who to rely on this time. But would you expect the kind of friction that occurred between him and some of his staff as happened last time?
I envision it to be less. And one of the things I was involved in the government setting it up in 2017, he was an outsider. He did not know many of these players that he ultimately fired. He had to fill a government, use that expression. And I think many of the people who he are not talked about that were very loyal to him and served him well are going to be returning, particularly in Homeland Security and some key positions. And I know who they are. And they are former Trump officials in the previous administration. So in some ways, it was a learning experience for him. He's not a Washington insider. He's not an establishment person. President Biden came in after being in power to being a vice president and senator for 30 years. He knows all the Washington players. President Trump had that disadvantage. Lastly, I will say this. President Trump's a businessman. Someone's not working, he fires them. This president, President Biden, fired no one. That's a mistake too.
There is a criticism of Donald Trump that he sometimes sees himself as the ruler of America rather than an elected official, effectively.
Well, I don't think that's a fair characterization, but the American people want decisive and firm leadership. and that's why they voted for him. I think what they're tired of is what many people for many years in our country, which no longer is said, that they're all the same. They're all the same. There's no difference between Republicans and Democrats. They're a revolving door. The difference between Bob Dole, who ran for president against Bill Clinton, they were arguing over around the edges issues. The word has been used, disruptor. The word has been used to describe President Trump, disruptor, change agent, and certainly anti-establishment. And that's the clear message. American people do not want business as usual, be it Democrat or Republican.
Now, Mr. Franco, Donald Trump has some very interesting characters around him, including Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Elon Musk. What do you think they will bring to the administration?
I think they'll bring fresh perspectives. They're outsiders. Obviously, Mr. Musk is the richest man in the world, and it's an understatement to call him an entrepreneur. So I think they will bring the private sector perspective. In the case of Mr. Musk, government efficiency, right-sizing government, that type of task I think he will be charged with most specifically. And in the case of Mr. Kennedy, of course, health and environment and other issues were the many criticisms of the current institutions, healthcare, oversight, and providers in our country at the federal level are just not delivering for the American people. I envision them running commissions. I do not envision them running departments of the government. I envision them to be advisors and coordinators and directors of departments and agencies. I do not envision them holding actual positions in government.
Well, you know, they are also characters that are quite divisive among the public. And the election revealed America to be overall a very deeply divided society, not just in terms of political ideology, but also along lines of social and economic issues. And in his victory speech, the president-elect said that he wanted to heal the nation. He talked about healing the nation. Considering these major differences and what was a very divisive campaign, how can Donald Trump go about, you know, fulfilling that promise and uniting the country?
Well, I think that's a superb question. President Biden said he was going to unify us and bring us together. That never happened. I think one of the statements that the president made is that not only does he want to work with Democrats, but he wants to seriously think and consider many of their policy objectives, particularly in the case of environment, healthcare, and so forth. Mr. Kennedy is a liberal. I think those views are not necessarily going to be traditionally conservative views. I think that will have a lot of appeal. It is a divided country. It can be united. I think the biggest thing the president can do, and I think he'll do it differently, is the rhetoric that attacks the opposition. I think if that is toned down, I think that will bring people around. I'm not going to finger point, but both sides have used language that has only served to divide the American people more. To refer to President Trump as Hitler, a fascist, coming from the presidential candidate and the sitting president is quite startling. And at the same time, on our side, we've used language as well that has called into question the loyalty to the United States, the loyalty to our way of life. So I think if that is toned down by both sides, I think that is up to the president to set that tone. I think that will go a long way.
I think that was one of the big things. I mean, it went both ways, fascist, Hitler,
yes,
you know, comparisons.
Both ways.
As someone who knows this city and knows the system so well, how surprised were you at how vitriolic everything was?
Well, I'm surprised, and then I'm not surprised, because I think it reflects a society. Something I've said for a long time. I've worked in the building behind here for a long time. Vice President Cheney, who was not exactly a Trump fan, to say the least, they were asking him recently about the good old days when I worked in the Bush administration. And he said, I don't quite remember it that way. And either do I. I think there's always been a sharp divide. It has become, I think, more sharply divided, but that's been the society as a whole. It's been social media and the rest of it. No one's landed from Mars and taken over the White House or the Congress. This is a mirror of the American people. So when you see the vitriolic language, when you see the way people are presenting their views, it's the views I read on or see on podcasts, listen on podcasts or social media. It reflects the society as a whole.
Polls have shown that one of the biggest concerns Americans have right now is the high cost of living, the economy.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what strategies, you know, Donald Trump has up his sleeve to resolve these.
Oh, I think they're very clear. I think the reason for of the high inflation has been runaway government spending. Now, you can blame both sides on this, but certainly the so-called misnamed Inflation Reduction Act that Vice President Harris broke the tie on set off the worst inflation we've had in this country in 40 years. So I think two things are going to happen. Number one is you're going to lower taxes, particularly corporate taxes, and stimulate growth. You're going to extend the current tax cuts for every single American. I think that will stimulate growth. And then in addition to that, in terms of controlling inflation, it's government regulation. It's simple. And he has also said the energy policies that he has repeatedly said have caused inflation in this country. So if we bring gasoline down, again, to the levels we had in the Trump administration, transportation costs and the rest of it will go down. It is a simple proposition. You either believe in the government directing the economy, that usually does not work. It does not work in this country, at least, or you believe in the private sector. So those policies would be less government regulations and lower taxes and different energy policies. And I think you'll see a turnaround. Wall Street reacted for a reason. And Wall Street reacted not for just corporate profits. It sees a growing economy ahead.
Now, interestingly enough, Donald Trump also has been quite tough with his rhetoric on China and Chinese goods imports, saying he's going to impose very heavy tariffs on those. There are those who believe that such tariffs actually just come back to the consumer at the till.
Yeah.
You know, they have to pay more for the commodities. So isn't there the risk that this will backfire on Donald Trump?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, severe tariffs were imposed on a host of Chinese goods, and President Biden and Vice President Harris criticized them in 2020, and when they came into power, they kept those tariffs on China. So the tariffs began in the previous administration. I see tariffs as a tool, and that is a tool for fair trade practices. All we want is a level playing field. Now, if we can't get there, we will impose tariffs to protect American workers and protect productivity in this country. I don't think tariffs across the board and starting a trade war internationally is what will happen. I think what will happen as a consequence of the threat of tariffs is that we'll actually see fewer tariffs than have been advertised in the political campaign. But for example, Chinese vehicles that are coming in through China and things that we think are fundamentally unfair, if those things continue, I think you will see tariffs imposed on China and potentially other countries. I will say I see that as a growing bipartisan position on tariffs. Now, I know the president has said he's going to slap all these tariffs instantly and overnight. I don't think that will happen. I think that is the way President Trump speaks to have leverage, whether it's on Ukraine, NATO spending, things that he will do if results aren't forthcoming in terms of negotiated results. And I think that's why he has been a success in the past.
Sir, I have a couple of questions about foreign policy for you in just a moment. Before I get to those, though, President-elect Trump says he wants to reform what he refers to as the deep states. He wants to purge what he calls the unaccountable bureaucrats, particularly in the law enforcement and security agencies. Wouldn't that lend credibility to the accusations from Democrats that he wants to be a dictator and that, not my words, of course, but, we've heard them in his campaigns as well.
Well, one of the advantages and disadvantages of being here in Washington 40 years, and one of the advantages is I know how it works in terms of the departments and how the bureaucracy works. This notion that these bureaucrats are somehow nonpartisan, that they're just doing their work, a lot of them are, but many of them are not. The fact of the matter is these people vote. The voting in this area reflects their prejudices. These people do position papers. They famously, something we call here inside Washington, tee up policy proposals, and they're all coming from the left, by and large from the left, in all of the departments of the government. So I think one of the proposals, for example, is decentralizing Washington, D.C., moving parts of the government to other parts of the country. So other Americans that are not within this, what we call sometimes the swamp, are making the decisions. But somehow this notion that 3 million people who work in government in this metropolitan area are not political, please. And so I think part of the reforms will be civil service reforms were established in the administration of President Theodore Roosevelt, not Franklin Roosevelt, and that requires reform. It's a different country than it was when this system was in place, and it does require a cleaning up. I think there have been partisan decisions regarding persecutions of President Trump that were made at both the Justice Department and at federal level and in different states as well.
What words of comfort do you have for the almost half the population that did vote for Kamala Harris, who some of whom are very distraught and worried about the next 4 years?
Well, I think this, again, everything comes around and goes around. One of the things about our system is there will not be a permanent Republican majority. There will be another Democratic president. There will be a Democratic Congress. It's just the nature of our system. It's a question of, I think, an examination. We've done it in the past as well. And that's why Donald Trump became president after Mitt Romney lost in 2012. An examination, sometimes referred to as a post-mortem politically, of how they have to have their messaging. The consolation is you have the messaging right, you can get these constituencies back. Doesn't mean necessarily adopting our positions. I really understand that other people have ideas that I don't necessarily share that can become majority views in the country. So I think any political party learns from its losses. We have, they will come back. Sometime in the future, I hope we will have a discussion when I'm in the minority and we'll be talking about a Democrat president and a Democrat Congress. Of that, I am sure.
Well, on the issue of America's huge influence across the world, President Trump says he wants peace in the world. Now, I wonder how, as Commander-in-Chief, he'll be able to end the Ukraine conflict in a fair way, address the concerns of the Ukrainian people, while also addressing Russia's concerns about NATO on its doorstep.
Well, one of the things he has said, and he has said it very clearly, it's been an America first policy, and he's going to put our interests first. And that means peace through strength. He has said it that he wants to strengthen the military, particularly the Navy and a number of other areas where there are serious deficiencies, I think, in our defense capabilities. But he does not believe America is the world's policeman. He believes in a role for America, be it in Ukraine and, of course, the Middle East. But he wants to see it when it's very much in our geopolitical interest to be engaged and not be the model that has been used by sometimes referred to as neocons in our country, that we have a role to bring democracy to everywhere in the world, including places like Afghanistan that didn't turn out very well. To your question specifically on Ukraine, I think there's going to be he's spoken to President Zelensky. I think there's a lot of faith that President Trump being a negotiator, he has said he will end it very quickly and one day, on day one. I think he's going to work on this as quickly as possible. I think it will be a solution that is negotiated, that addresses things fairly. Now, those are some easy words to say. One has to remember that in the Obama administration, Obama-Biden administration, in 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine and it seized Crimea, it seized Ukrainian territory. I didn't see a massive reaction by the Obama administration to bring military aid and to come to Ukraine's aid at that time. So that was acceptable in 2014. And I think today's day and age on this, whether it's territorial or other arrangements with Russia and Ukraine, there can be a negotiated settlement. He has said the conflict needs to end. I think he has leverage with Putin that I don't think Biden had. And I think there will be a resolution of that. I will say this lastly. When this conflict started in Ukraine, General Milley, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and other American leaders said that Russia would take over Ukraine in 72 hours. They envisioned it to be a 3-day operation. And of course, it hasn't turned out that way. And that's before massive aid from the West came. So if there's any threat that Russia, with an economy the size of Texas, I understand its nuclear arsenal exists, but with the economy the size of Texas, and it's been bogged down, to say the least, in Ukraine, that it is a threat for most of Europe. I just don't believe it or buy it.
Now, of course, Donald Trump has also said he wants to end the crisis in Gaza, the issue of Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah and so on. Can he be an honest broker, considering he's gone back and forth on the issue of a two-state solution? The Abraham Accords, of course, which he was championing. Now, even the Saudis have stepped back a bit and said they have conditions to go there. How can Donald Trump create the right kind of blueprint for peace in the Middle East and avoid a wider conflict?
Well, I think one of the things that's been quite underestimated and not reported on, certainly in this country, has been the accomplishments in the Middle East under the first Trump administration. And they have to do first with the Abraham Accords and the relationship he has established with the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia, which I think was a very strong relationship. obviously, and we've seen that had only grown during his administration. While at the same time, he was the first president, despite many promises, to not only stand with Israel in its quest to move its embassy to Jerusalem, but from Tel Aviv, but he did it. And he did it without conflict breaking out in the Middle East. He did this without disrupting the growing relationship with the Arab states. So what I think this represents is he has credibility with both sides. He is an unabashed supporter of Prime Minister Netanyahu. There's no question about that. He has said that Israel should get the job done and get it done quickly. He is referring to, of course, ending the terrorist organization's capability to inflict the damage they have done in the region, Hamas and Hezbollah. That's what he's referring to. And so in that regard, he is a strong supporter of Israel. But he has a credibility with the Arab states that I don't think President Biden did. After all, President Biden is the one who referred to Saudi Arabia as a pariah state. Underlying all of this in the region, when everybody speaks candidly, is a concern about Iran and its influence. And that goes to Yemen, that goes to, of course, what's going on in Gaza and in Lebanon and the rest of it. That is the target. President Trump has said, Iran will never have a nuclear weapon if I'm president. And I think he's going to keep that promise. And that, I think, privately is reassuring to the Arab states. I think he will find a two-state solution because he has leverage with both Israel and with our Arab partners. I don't think this administration had it with either.
Mr. Franco, final thought. Considering your close relationship with Donald Trump, are you expecting far less sleep in the next 4 years?
I am expecting less sleep. I am expecting less sleep, and certainly in the next 90 days during the transition period. But I do. But there will be exciting. It will be exciting insomnia.
Sir, great to speak with you.
Thank you so much.
Vice President Kamala Harris had spoken about having a to-do list when she entered the White House. But that task now falls instead to the president-elect Donald Trump. To help him prioritize a few policy issues, we asked global visitors to Washington to rank them on a presidential tier list like this. So let's hear what they had to say. So tell me where you've come in from.
Colombia and Austria.
All right, so now Donald Trump is going to be back in the White House. As people who are living overseas but might be affected by policies, what are you most worried about? What are you most happy about?
For me, I think it's going to be a big change for all of us immigrants. It's going to change the rules, and I hope everything gets better for us and for everyone too.
I think the climate is a big point that is going to change because he's he's also with the white and black persons. He's not in touch that much, and he wants America to be white again. And I don't like it so much because I think America is a land that everyone can come in and be a part of America. So I'm not a big fan of him. So yeah.
Well, let's do this. Let me get a board which has 5 of the key policies that they talked about during the election, and see. And you can put the number just next to the ones you think is most important. Which is the most important? There's only 5 of them. Okay. Let's try this. So look, we've got numbers are there. So border is, of course, immigration. Unity, they promised to get everyone back together again because the country was very divided. Ending wars, of course, Gaza and Russia, Ukraine. Climate, you mentioned, and economy for American people. So pick these numbers and just quickly push them into the board which you think is the most important. I guess you'll have to choose together.
I think economy will be the first.
Yeah.
Economy first. Great. Okay.
I'm not sure.
So border immigration, unity is getting everyone together again after all the politics.
Yeah, I think it's important right now because they are very divided right now.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think the climate is very important.
Yes.
So free.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
I want border.
Yeah. I think so too.
And 5.
And 5. Yeah.
And wars.
Any wars.
All right. Super. So tell me where you're from.
I'm from Egypt.
Welcome.
Yeah.
I'm from Kazakhstan.
Welcome again. So listen, it's an interesting time post-election in the USA. A lot of people are wondering, how things are going to be in the next 4 years as Donald Trump becomes president again. What are your concerns? What are you happy about? What are you worried about?
Yeah, I'm happy about that. It's going to be like lists for like immigration, like the illegal immigration. And I think it's going to be good for the economy. I mean, the day that Trump won the elections, the stocks went high and everything went very good, you know. So, and crypto, and I have some crypto, so that's good for me.
And you?
I'm not good in politics stuff, but I believe that it will work for America very good, and not only for America. As I know, Trump has very good relationship with the Russian Federation, and it might stop the war in Ukraine. And I believe that everything happens for the good reason.
Well, you know, during the election, they all talked about policies. And we have a board, we're creating a tier list. And we just want you to put the numbers next to the policies, the issues that you think are the most important. So it's 1 to 5. I'm going to bring this up to you. So, guys, if you want to just take those numbers and put them in the order of which you think are most important.
Oh, all right.
So border, of course, is immigration and so on. Unity is getting the country back together again. Ending wars.
Ending wars.
Okay, let's just put it here.
First thing for me.
Right.
Because, I live close to Gaza in Egypt.
Oh, goodness, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Okay. The second, I guess, borders.
Borders.
Okay. There you go.
Well, I'll put economy before borders, actually, but it's okay.
Joint agreement.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess unity.
Okay.
So what do you mean by unity here?
Well, it's, you know, the country got very divided here.
Divided,
so people are, worried about it. And so then 5 would be
climate.
Climate's coming in last.
Yeah, I mean, the weather's very nice today, so...
Oh, you're cheating. Hold this up and we'll just get a picture of you guys holding it. Thank you. A couple of quick questions. What's your general feeling on the way the vote went?
I think the way the vote went, it was mixed feelings. Really want the new administration to be successful in what they promised, things like economy, ending wars, things of that sort. If they can be successful, I think everyone will be happy at the end of it.
Do you think a new Trump administration is going to change things much, the way your life is, will it be affected?
I think so. Last time around, the economy was really good while he was president. At the end, it kind of suffered a little bit, but that everyone was in that boat together. But I think economy will be better.
Well, now Donald Trump is going to be back in the White House. What encourages you most and what scares you the most?
The encouragement part is he's now saying he's pro-legal immigration. So that's the encouraging part. He is going to turn around the economy. So that's also positive. The scary part is with which speed things are getting implemented. So it can be I just hope no rash decisions are taken. That would be something that I would look out for.
What's popular on social media is tier lists where different tier of priorities occur. So I'm going to show you a board that has 5 of the key policies that were referred to in the election. And I want to just get you to put numbers quickly against which you think are the most important of these. So, Neil, if you would, could you bring it over and you can... Yeah.
So I think ending wars would be the first priority, considering that will drive a lot of other things as well. The economy can be better if there are no wars, etc. The number 2 would be economy, considering he is the most pro-bullish economy person in this race. The third, I would say, would be in unity. So
bringing the country together.
Yep, and that while we are bringing up the economy, ending wars, bringing all the people together would be definitely a good one. And then border, just cleaning, not in the sense that making sure things are done due the legal process. And finally, climate change.
And he said he's going to drill.
Yes. The one thing I really want is we need to take a balance approach, not either this or that way. There is a balance that we can strike. Hopefully, we can come up with that as part of this.
Sir, thank you so much. So, guys, tell me where you're from.
I'm originally from California, and then I moved to Texas and Maryland.
California.
Okay, well, welcome. Welcome to the East Coast. Let me ask you, the election's over now. Donald Trump's going back into the White House. People are wondering what's going to happen. What do you like, what you don't like about what might happen?
I think it's really an era of uncertainty to try to figure out what's going to happen. I think just to read on people I've talked to, different sides. There's hopefulness. There's some sadness and there's some joy. But I think really the big thing is people have their fingers crossed, and hopefully we can pull it together and actually just work together for our country instead of all this other stuff.
A lot of people worried about the country becoming so divided. This campaign probably more than ever before. Did this concern you?
No.
You weren't worried about the divisions? Division's bad, and it's the worst I've seen in my life, and gone through a bunch of different presidents. I didn't think it was as bad as some people felt, maybe. Like we just came back from Gettysburg, and having seen where America was at that time when literally hundreds of thousands were dying, fighting a civil war, we're not there. And so I thought it was a little overplayed that people would talk about it being there. But the division's just bad. There was a time when we used to be able to just disagree and move on with our lives and do what's best, the best we can. And it just seemed that we've lost that sense of what's right and what's wrong and how to balance that, be able to just disagree and move on and do good things.
So I'm going to ask you a favor. What's big on social media now is tiers, layers of, priorities. So I've got a board, and it's like five of the policies that were discussed, from unity of the country to border, immigration and so on, economy and so on. And just put number by which one you think, in the order you think they're most important. Okay? So here, for example, which one would you make number one, which to number two, and so on?
I would say number one is definitely the economy. It always is. You can't feed your family. There's not much sense in talking about anything else. Number two, me personally, and it kind of goes together with the economy, because the border, no nation can just keep a wide open border and you'll see this in Europe. I spent 2 months in Europe, and you see the same thing over there. They're struggling with that. So I would definitely say number two, unity, just because if we don't get that piece together, that's got to be at least number three. Number four, war's never good.
Yeah, and so climate comes in number five.
And then, climate comes number five, because if all the other pieces aren't in place before that, what's the point? Let's make sure you get my good side.
Well, I've been fascinated by the way election coverage has evolved in recent years. So I wanted to find out what impact both mainstream and social media have had on the latest election. And also, how should the media handle the return of a president who regards them as fake and the enemy of the people? So for answers, I turn to Frank Sesno, who's one of America's most respected media analysts. He's a former White House correspondent and Washington bureau chief with CNN, and now directs strategy at George Washington University's School of Media and Public Affairs. Frank, I'm glad you could make some time. It's been a while.
It's been a while. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too. Let's get, first of all, your take on the US election and the fact Donald Trump had quite the landslide and surprised a lot of people. How surprised were you?
I was not surprised, but shocked. I thought that there was a very good chance that Trump would win and that he could win big, because all the polling showed it consistently, margin of error, tie, dead heat for so long, months. And that dynamic didn't shift. And the polls, every time he's run, have undercounted his actual performance. What Trump tapped into, and I have heard it again and again and again, is that people are angry at the government, the status quo. They're frustrated with the economy and inflation. They feel the border is out of control, and that those who have been in charge have not been responsive to these needs. I think they also feel, and the Democrats have played into this, that it's a party of the elite, the college-educated, who somehow look down their noses at others. And so there were many forces that came together here to elect Trump and to elect him in such a sweeping fashion. It's a very strong statement.
As an American, as well as a senior media figure, are you bracing yourself for a major difference in the way the US works, both domestically and internationally?
Yes, I am bracing myself for a very substantial shift. And I think a shift that people haven't still been able to really fully apprehend, because last time Trump came in, it was sort of surprising. And there were people who came with him from the traditional Republican Party, the gatekeepers, the guardrails. Those are all gone now. Trump knows where the levers of power are because he's had them. He's had 4 years to stew about it. And as he has made very, very clear in his public remarks, he does seek a degree of retribution and revenge. And the people who he's bringing with him, those who've already been nominated for some positions, have very strong, some would say, would use the word extreme, positions on things. So I think it's going to be a fiercely anti-regulatory, nationalistic, if not isolationist government that's going to be ratcheting up trade war pressures and other things to assert this MAGA agenda that Donald Trump very clearly talked about and brings to office.
I spoke to one of his advisors, knows him well, who said he expects Donald Trump to tone down the rhetoric to a large degree, that things might be a bit calmer this time.
I have never seen Donald Trump tone down the rhetoric, and even if he does, there are people around him who don't want to or don't need to. Because now it's not about rhetoric, now it's about power. They don't need to scream about it and cajole the party, whatever, and plenty of people voted for them and like them and want this. And I think we need to listen to that and understand what that means. But they know what they want to do. They've advertised this very clearly. And so it's not about rhetoric, it's about reality. It's not about speeches, it's about action.
What did this very divisive election teach you about the way Americans consume news?
Well, I think this very divisive election taught us a lot of things. First of all, I think it taught us that Americans are not very good at listening to other Americans. I think it taught us that the years of division and this notion that, well, if you just look at Donald Trump and understand what he's doing, you'll realize he's not qualified for office, has not been a message that has sold. And the role of traditional media has been eviscerated. The role of traditional media has been so weakened and so changed. Candidates don't need the media, traditional media. That's why Trump didn't do a second debate. It's why he sat for virtually no mainstream media interviews. And Harris did very little of that either. I mean, so they went through their influencers, their podcasters, their friendly interviewers to get to the niche audiences they wanted. Social media filled in a lot of the blanks. And the role of traditional news, of traditional media, which I know well from previous years, it still exists, but it's been marginalized.
With social media playing a much bigger role in everything nowadays, as you've indicated, what does it tell you about the way election coverage has evolved?
Election coverage has evolved to cover what you can and grab that piece of people's attention that you can get. Broadcast networks audiences are down. Cable news network audiences are down. The old print, legacy print media are down. Even the digital publications have struggled. Local and regional news organizations have laid off massive amounts of staff and lost circulation and clicks and viewing. As people have gone to TikTok, to their other social media platforms, and to one another. And the big gains, the big winners here are the big podcasters. These people who have YouTube channels and podcasts that have, in some cases, millions of devoted listeners and viewers. That's a sea change. And those podcasters and YouTube channel stars, they don't play by the journalistic rules that you and I used to play by. It is not about accuracy above all else. They don't have producers and editors who are gatekeepers and who fact check them before they go on the air. So that level of media accountability has been whittled down.
So how should the media, at least the mainstream media, handle the return of a president who sees them as fake and as an enemy of the people?
The mainstream media confront a massive challenge now because they are going to be targeted again, and probably more effectively and in a more sustained way than they were when Trump was in for the first time. He has famously or infamously called media journalists enemy of the people. So it's not merely an adversary in our constitutional system, it's an enemy in our culture. That is a very dramatic and very dangerous shift. And so what do the media need to do? They need to understand that they have a job to do. They need to be more, I think, much more transparent with the audience, explain what they're covering, why they're covering it. When they fact check something, make sure it's really clear where those fact checks come from, what the sources are, and then understand that this is the world that they now live in. They're not going to get the kind of pass or mass audience that they once had, and they're just going to have to stay at the job.
Is real freedom of speech at risk now then?
You know, that's a really hard question. Is real freedom of speech at risk? You know, this is a trait that runs very deep in America. It goes all the way back to our founding. It is part of our culture. We have a lot of time and attention on the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. There should be as much attention on the First Amendment, the right for free speech and the right to assembly and all the rest. I don't think in the long run free speech is endangered in the United States. It will come under assault and it will be called into question, as it has been, with increasing vehemence and volume. But Americans hold this very dear, and there are a lot of people who very much respect free speech, who consume mainstream media, who voted for Donald Trump. They're not looking for the New York Times to be thrown out into the deep blue sea. They may not agree with it. They may think it's hostile to them. But fundamentally, some do, and they will be the noisiest. But many don't, and we will see how this plays out. So here's how I would say it. I think a free and independent press will be very much under attack. And in some cases will have some existential threats that it has to deal with. I think the larger calling of free speech, I hope, is stronger than any one administration, and over time will prevail.
I guess one of the questions now then is the definition of free speech something new? Because people have talked about what isn't allowed and what is allowed on social media, and there have been fights over that. The whole Elon Musk taking over Twitter, now making it X, and what he allowed to happen there. There's a question of what is the definition of freedom of speech?
There are certain words we use a lot in the United States that we assume everybody understands and agrees with. Democracy is one, free speech is another. And they don't. There's great disagreement on both, because both sides thought they were defending democracy in this last election. And both sides talk about free speech and they mean something completely different. And so I think that, it's going to be a very strange ride and a difficult ride, because there are people who speak about free speech, but they actually want to crush certain things that they don't want to hear. News that's not popular, facts that go against them, science that is contradictory is fake news. No, it's not fake news. It's just information you don't agree with or you don't like, but it's not fake. And that's the challenge and the job, I think, of what's left of the mainstream media. Explain what's real. Make it clear that their job fundamentally is seeking truth. And explain to the audience how they do that so that people can understand and, I hope, trust what it is they're doing.
You say that, but based on some of the other comments you made about clicks and everything, the demise based on clicks and so on, the question is mainstream media effectively dead now?
Mainstream media isn't dead, but it's not thriving either. I don't want to say it's on life support. In some places it is, but overall, mainstream media still reach millions of people. The question is, how has the audience divided over that? And they reach more people who are like-minded now than it used to be. And so it's a different audience, but it's still a big audience, and it's an influential audience, and it's an audience that matters.
Well, the world's gone very digital, and it's now all about digital media. And I wonder, what are the implications, considering that, for the way people get their information?
The digital media revolution has been underway for quite some time. The trends are quite clear. People are consuming quicker, shorter pieces, more video. Now with TikTok, we call vertical videos. They're still reading long pieces. New Yorker and other publications such as that are doing rather well, as a matter of fact. But the mainstream audience, the vast majority of Americans, do not tune in to a nightly newscast. There's no 30 minutes on the air or single paper that shows up on your doorstep that summarizes everything according to a set of journalistic rules about sources and attribution and accuracy and correcting mistakes the way it used to be. That time is long gone. And so people, through social media and other things, are consuming what they want. I refer to it this way. Everybody in this country now is their own managing editor. Yeah. Every person in this country now is their own executive producer. They are responsible, not some paid professional gatekeeper, for the information that they consume, whether it's right, wrong, misleading, lies, truth, whatever. That's a big responsibility. And the question is, are we up to it? And that's an unanswered question.
Now, tell me about your project, Planet Forward, because that's a hybrid of digital and conventional media, from what I understand, to tackle issues of the environment and so on. And how does that hybrid version of web and what you might call conventional media now work?
So Planet Forward is a platform for students and others around the world to tell stories about food, water, biodiversity, built environment, energy, and the ideas, the innovations that can literally move the planet forward. This is about inventions. This is about our future. It's not about arguing about things. It's about what's new and different. And it is a multimedia platform. And so we encourage people to do what is happening out in the world, to take advantage of the media tools that they have, to be clever, creative, fact-based though. Some do podcasts, some do videos, some do text, some do infographics. And that's what's happening in the media space, and we want to capitalize on that, to tell stories in the most interesting and compelling ways, to meet people where they are, and present the information in appropriate but clever ways. I want the storytellers on Planet Forward to be storytellers, to tell a good story, fact-based, but something that's interesting and engaging, that has real people at the heart of it, characters who can explain what we're doing to change the way we power the world or drink our water or breathe our air, whatever it is. And it's very interesting because it's also a younger demographic. And so the people who are our storytellers are college age students. So they're 18, 22. They're experimenting with media. They're showing us probably where the future of the professional media landscape is going to be.
So irrespective of it being hybrid in terms of its technology, you're essentially it's still all about storytelling.
It's all about storytelling. People are hunters and gatherers of information, I believe. They want that. But they are also consumers of great stories, right? Whether it's the Bible or the Quran or anything, we are all about stories. That's how we remember. It's how we empathize. It's how we convey fact and information. So what I'm trying to do and encourage through Planet Forward is really creative, thoughtful storytelling. Capture an image that makes someone look and wonder. Craft a sentence that is captivating and creative. Build a video that opens with a sunset or a sunrise that it's just spellbinding. That's what good storytelling involves, as well as the story arc, as we call it. And if we can do that well, and we can inform people along the way, that to me is a win-win.
There are those who would say, though, that the problem or the challenge that storytelling faces is that fake news, and even worse, deep fake, has moved us from an information age to a disinformation age. And I wonder how that affects your role. You're still very active in the media as someone who is a commentator and a senior media figure.
Well, fair enough. You know, good storytelling and good understanding of the media can be put to good use or bad use. The Nazis did it, the Soviets did it. That's where documentaries started. And they were started to move public opinion and manipulate people, not based on truth, but based on untruth and propaganda. And so one of the things we have to realize is that storytelling power now is in everyone's hands. And if you want to use that power maliciously to misinform or disinform, you can do that. We see that with deep fakes. We see that with what AI is doing. We see that with the misuse of certain bots and algorithms. So I think we face a very, very serious threat to the information that a democracy and an informed populace needs, with what I call this infodemic of mis and disinformation. It's poisonous. And we could talk all we want about, oh, well, you can look into it, and you can. People don't do that. People can consume bad information, and it's presented so credibly, so authoritatively, that it's almost impossible to determine sometimes what's real and what is actually fake.
And technology is obviously helping that authenticity to appear.
Technology helps the authenticity, and technology delivers it faster than ever in human history to more people around the planet than anybody ever could do. And so the implications are enormous.
Now, your role as a professor at George Washington University involves you teaching young minds. And there's, it's tough for them now to have to navigate the world of news and information with all these challenges there. And I wonder, how you meet that challenge. How do you get them to think critically at a time when everything is pushing them away from critical thinking and into confirmation bias and echo chambers?
Well, I actually think our students are good at critical thinking, and that's really what I insist upon. We talk, for example, in the class I teach now about costs, trade-offs, and complexity. Every issue has those things. What's the cost of doing something a certain way? What are the trade-offs involved? And what is the underlying complexity? How do you understand those things, and how do you incorporate those things into your storytelling, whatever platform you're on? If you're going to inform people about the world, you could inform them about a binary, black and white, very simple world. That's not the world. Maybe a great speech, but it's not the world. The world is filled with shades of gray and with triumph and tragedy and with complexity. And so that's what I really try, because this is the world they know. This media anarchy that we've got now is the world they know. They don't know anything else. They're going to go out in that, they're going to work in that, and they're going to end up leading that. And so if we can base them with critical thinking, understanding how empowered someone is, powerful someone is when they are in the media, like you talk to millions of people. That's a powerful responsibility. Be mindful of that. That's what we try to get them to do.
The tricky part is they're up against a world where it's all about the clicks and the hits.
And about your personal brand. And is your personal brand more important than your credibility or truthfulness? In some cases, people have answered, yes, I want my personal brand. I want more audience. And if I have to yell and scream and lie or misrepresent, it's okay. No, it's not. But that's the world we're in.
Frank, how do you deal with the now super sensitive era of the woke culture, as it's called, where it's so easy to put a foot wrong, where it's so easy to say something innocently, and of course it can just backfire completely. How do you also teach that to young minds?
Well, how do we teach that the woke world exists?
Not so much that, but how do you teach them that there should be more of a middle ground, perhaps, than this kind of oversensitivity?
That's what we were talking about just today in class, as a matter of fact. What is the lesson that we've learned from this election? The lesson that we learned from this election is that there's a very deep disconnect in the United States of America among people. You know, I teach a class called The Art of the Interview. And I say that it doesn't matter if you're a journalist or not, asking powerful questions, good questions, sometimes reflective questions, is vital and will help you succeed in whatever line of work you go into. You're in the sciences, you're an advocate, you're a lawyer, you're an astronaut. You want to ask the right questions. Is that safe? Good interviewers and good questioners are also something else. They're active, engaged listeners. And they're not just listening for what confirms what they already believe. They're actually listening for, I didn't think of it that way before. And if we can do more of that, maybe that will contribute. That's what we try anyway.
Is it ever going to be possible to get past the power of social media and the influences that can shape the message so effectively and shape people's minds?
No, I think social media is here to stay. I think the distorting effects of social media are here to stay. I think the challenge is not on the side of shutting that down, because that's going to be very hard, if not impossible to do. We may be able to make some progress towards some of that. Europe is in a different place than the United States is, for example. But it still exists, and it's still so easy, and it's still in real time. So it's about media literacy and teaching people from a very young age what's real, what's not. How do you figure that out? How do you ask yourself, is there an agenda at work here? What does this side want to say? Is somebody a fair broker, a fair judge? Are they giving both sides a hard time? Are they holding both sides accountable? So I think that it's the distortion is, we're in this hall of mirrors now, and we have to understand that. And once you understand you're in a hall of mirrors and you realize what you're looking at is not the true image, you can maybe make some adjustments in your head. At least you understand that what you're seeing is not to be taken literally. And that is where it's going to be. The answers here are not going to come from the top down. It's not going to come from the New York Times or the London Times or the China Times, for that matter. It's going to come ultimately from the bottom up, and people who are empowered because of all the technology because of all the access to so much information that they've got, and figure out how to manage that.
And yet, going back to trained journalists, you and I experienced a similar thing starting out in this profession. I joke sometimes I'm a dinosaur because it was beaten into me not to have an opinion in my reporting. My reporting was meant to be very much down the middle, irrespective of my actual opinion. Is there a place for that kind of journalism anymore? That's the worry. Where does it go?
That's the worry. Where does it go? I sent a memo when I was bureau chief at CNN one time to all the reporters in Washington. And I said, when you're on the air and you're speaking live, please try to avoid 2 words. They were, I think. Because I said the audience doesn't actually care what you think. They care what you've seen, what you've heard, and what you can report from having been there or having had access to a source or a document. What you think, which sounds like your opinion, is not what you should do. But that, in some ways, is the coin of the realm now. That's what's changed. And so, look, I'm fundamentally an optimist. I think that people are fundamentally hunters and gatherers, as I say, of information. The most popular, this is a few years ago, so I don't know if this works, but the most popular review site was about mattresses, because people spend 8 hours a day on mattresses and they do all sorts of things on mattresses and they want to make sure they get the very best. So they do research, they do homework to find the best mattress. Some still buy terrible mattresses and they're all out there. The same will be true with our information. For people who care, and that's the question, for people who care, there is very good journalism out there. There's excellent journalism and investigation and expose. But you've got to be the informed consumer and go find it.
Well, that's the difference. There's reporting and there's commenting, for example, and opinion bolsters and so on. The way it was described to me years ago at the BBC when I was training was take out the adjectives as a reporter. There's no room for adjectives. They can add a nuance. They can add a perspective. So that's the key worry. That is it possible to define the kind of platforms that will actually allow for proper reporting?
All right, I said I was an optimist. I'm going to repeat it. I think, yes, I think there is an opportunity here. I think it's an amazing marketing opportunity for real journalism to say, in this wild and crazy world where everything is about fact and anger and and mis and disinformation, here's how we're going to work. This is information you can trust. It will be thorough. It will be transparent. We will be holding all sides to account. We will acknowledge when we make mistakes and try to capitalize on that. Now, that's easier said than done. And some news organizations have done it and it hasn't paid them huge dividends because there are a lot of businesses that have tried that and their fortunes have flagged because the business model has changed.
Well, I was thinking of that in light of the US election now. I mean, there was not a lot of scope for that kind of journalism.
I don't know. I mean, I think that,
everyone was looking for commentators rather than reporters.
I don't think everyone was looking for commentators. I think some people were. I was very upset at what I saw in the coverage because so much of the media, even the supposed professional media, fell into the same trap. Report on the polls, report on the rallies, how many people were there, report on the latest outrage or soundbite. How much hard work was there looking at both candidates to see what would they actually do if they were running the State Department in different places around the world? What would their policy actually be if they ran the Environmental Protection Agency? How will each really dig into climate change? Healthcare, inflation, what will they really do on inflation? There was some, but not nearly enough, and not targeted to the people who were doing the voting and the lives that they were leading.
Frank, you joined CNN in 1984, just 4 years after it actually launched. And of course, presidential debates and all the coverage was very different back then. When you look back on, you did debate coverage yourself. When you look back on that and then you see the way debates are being handled now, what goes through your head?
Debates? I don't know. I mean, in the once upon a time world, debates mattered. People listened. Policy counted. So did stumbles and sound bites and George Herbert Walker Bush looking at his watch like he was bored, like he didn't want to be there. Gerald Ford talking about Poland as a free country when it was behind the Iron Curtain. I mean, those debates pulled millions and millions. But the big difference was that there was no social media. There was no off-ramp for the candidates where they could then just go to the neighborhoods they wanted to the to the narrow audience they were trying to meet. They needed the debates. That's the difference. The difference is the candidates needed the debates, just as they needed the mainstream media at that time. That's how they got to the millions and millions of people who are casting ballots. They don't need those things anymore. And they have concluded, as we saw in this election, that they're better off without them, at least largely. And we will pay that price, because it was a place where informed people who were brought there to give them a hard time and hold them accountable to what they'd said or promised or what didn't make sense. They were paid to show up and ask them those questions. And when you're doing a friendly interview with a podcaster who's already endorsed you, they're not paid to give you a hard time.
As your career progressed at CNN, you ended up as the Washington bureau chief, right in the heart of US politics. You got to interview George H.W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, actually, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush. When you look at how presidents evolved in their nature, first of all, many people wouldn't have imagined a black president like Barack Obama, and then many wouldn't have imagined a businessman and showman like Donald Trump as president. How would those interviews go now if you were dealing with the latest lot, if you like?
If I were interviewing Donald Trump?
For example.
I'd probably come at an interview like that more like a lawyer than a journalist. Journalists ask a lot of open-ended questions. Lawyers do not. Lawyers know what the answer is going to be. They anticipate it, and they're very deliberate in where they're trying to take somebody to demonstrate something specific to the jury, whether it's an admission or an explanation. And I think that the standard journalistic approach doesn't work anymore because, or at least not, often it doesn't work, because candidates come prepped. They come prepped to ignore the question. They come prepped to hit their talking points. They come prepped to talk around something. And that's what happens when you ask somebody, well, tell me about your policy. How's that going to work? Whereas if you are asking questions like a lawyer, is it true that on such and such a date you gave a speech before these people and you pledged the following? And somebody's going to, either they got to say yes or no. It's a different style of interviewing. It's much more confrontational. You got to know what you're talking about in advance or you're going to look like an idiot. But I think we need to rethink the way these media appearances go. Of course, then the candidates will say, well, that was unpleasant. I'm not doing that again. So it can be counterproductive. We're in a very difficult place because when I was on the air at CNN, we felt we had a mission, which was to put on the senator or congressman or president or prime minister and ask them about their policies, give them an opportunity to explain, and then hold them accountable for, well, how are you going to pay for that? Or what about what the critics say, or whatever it is? They felt they actually had an obligation and that the camera was an opportunity to convince or to talk to people and that it was good for them to be there. That's the dynamic that's changed.
But also for the press corps in Washington, the whole discussion, the briefings, press briefings has become a very staged thing as well now, hasn't it?
The press briefings in Washington, a lot of them have been circuses for a long time. The White House press briefing has never been serious. That's not true. I mean, bits and pieces. But the standard press briefings, the standard idea of a story, a deadline, a news cycle, that's just all gone now. There's no news cycle. We're on 24/7. The news cycle changes by the second. Every news organization operates in real time. That didn't used to happen at all. The White House, we had this very quaint thing called a lid. And the press secretary or somebody would, we have a lid for the day, which means no more news is going to be announced. And reporters finished their stories and went home. There was this set of rules that everybody played by. And those rules are gone now because everything happens in real time. It's a 24/7 business, which is why it's quite difficult to be at this level of journalism and actually do this day in and day out because it's exhausting.
Well, as I wrap up, I want to get your thought on a couple of things. Having been in the heart of the political world in the US here in DC for so long and watching what's been going on for so long, there's a lot of post-mortem going on now about the election. Democrats wondering what went wrong. Is America ready for a woman president, maybe a woman of color? Is that one of the reasons that things went wrong for the Democrats? Or is it just something else that we don't know?
I think racism and sexism played a role in this election, but it played a role alongside so many other things. Kamala Harris had 3 months to run a campaign. That's an historic and very brief period of time. Kamala Harris was tied to Joe Biden, and he was a very unpopular president, largely through his own doing. Inflation and immigration were issues that the Democrats underestimated and really missed in terms of both how they acted and how they communicated. They did not address that on an ongoing basis. The world has been a particularly complicated and unnerving place for Americans over the last decade, really, from Afghanistan and terrorism to global trade and the impact that has had. There has been a woke culture and a culture war in America playing out, and that's not going to go away, and that hurt Kamala Harris. The Democrats have become the party of the elite, and it sounds like the coastal elites talking down to a lot of other people. At least that's how many people interpret it. Good people felt that they were not being listened to and voted for Donald Trump. They were not necessarily treated, or they didn't really feel like they were being treated in that way. So there are a lot of things at play here. I think it's very premature to say that a woman of color could not be president of the United States. I think that time will come, and not far off. If the United States of America could twice elect a man named Barack Hussein Obama, it can elect a woman, but the time and the place need to be right. And whoever it is needs to be an exceptional candidate, as Obama was.
Frank, thanks for giving me the time to pick your brains. Always good to talk with you.
My pleasure.
Thank you, sir. Well, up next, we have another White House correspondent and Washington bureau chief, but this time it's Al Arabiya's Nadia Bilbassi. She secured an interview with Donald Trump at a key moment in the campaign, just 2 weeks before the election. The president-elect was famous for his spontaneous and sometimes combustible press briefings. Well, that contrasted with Joe Biden, who has never addressed the assembled media in the White House briefing room. So, is she expecting a similarly unscripted sequel from Donald Trump? Nadia, I'm glad you could make some time for us. Now, it's kind of almost in-house because we're together at the same network, but you've done 6 elections now. How different was this for you, covering the very divisive one?
Riz, this is completely different than anything we have seen before for so many reasons. Number one, you have 3 months before the election and you have completely new candidate. We didn't go through the primary system. You know, we covered the primaries, but for a different candidate, which is President Biden. So it was very, very different in every sense of the word. We have a candidate who was a vice president, a woman, and the whole world probably was waiting to see if the U.S. is going to elect the first a woman president, and a woman from a minority, which is African and Asian origin. We also have a president who's been indicted, a former president who's been indicted. We had a former president who had been attempted assassination on his life twice. It was very strange in so many ways, and the polling was showing that they are so close to each other. So I never seen a percentage that close till almost hours before the results came out.
Yeah, how surprised were you by it being literally a landslide for Donald Trump?
I think it wasn't just me. I think President Trump was surprised too.
How's your relationship with him? Because you served as a correspondent here, as a bureau chief, during his first presidency, and of course you got to interview him recently.
True. When he was in the White House, I think he has a very combative relationship with the media in general. You have to admit that certain journalists were, they were seeking this kind of conflict, and we saw it on air, actually, on many networks. This is why he was very probably upset and angry of how the media in the U.S. is treating him. For me, it was actually when people ask me, because I covered the White House since President Bush, we have more access during President Trump than any other president, which is very surprising. Why? Because he did not follow the system. The system is always being like, if there's a press conference, then the White House will pick and choose certain reporters to ask the president a question, maybe 9 reporters out of 60 or 80. With him, he will open it and he goes like, anybody want to ask a question? We go to the Oval Office for what they call a pool spray, supposedly for 5 minutes. We can say for an hour. He will take every question because President Trump came from the media background. He understands the value of the media, and he also cannot stay away from being the headline in the media. So he always liked to generate news and make news, which is good news for journalists. But again, this relationship that he called the media the enemy of the people. Now, for me, I've been working with this interview for years, in fact. It happens in the last 6 months, when basically I called every connection that I know that will lead to him. And finally, I got a phone call from one of his closest advisors in April. And he told me, we're not doing interviews with the foreign media now, but I promise you, after Labor Day, we're gonna revisit this. And he said, I heard from so many people about you. So this is how it worked in the end.
Nadia, we've seen so many divisions in this country, especially in recent years. What sort of challenges do you face being a correspondent with a Middle Eastern background, knowing both sides, if you like?
Look, I mean, sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's difficult. I remember being close to this street, actually, on Pennsylvania Avenue on January 6th in 2020, when Trump supporters came here to protest, actually, the results, and it turned to be one of the most significant days in the U.S. history with the attack on the Capitol. Now, at the time it was Corona time, so we were wearing masks. So we were attacked verbally by Trump supporters because they perceive us as generally the media. And the media for them are hostile media. And if you wear in a mask means you're liberal or you're a Democrat. So they will say certain things that it didn't bother me, to be honest, because I take my job as a journalist, and as a journalist, you're open to all kinds of abuse most of the time. So you carry on with your job. Being in the Middle East, it's an advantage sometimes, and I relate it to the Bush administration because all the trouble in the world at the time was in the Middle East. The U.S. invasion of Iraq, the Syrian troops withdrawing from Lebanon, the Israeli-Palestinian question. So for me, every time there is something happening in the Middle East, I'll go to the White House and through my contact, and I say, this is a good time for the president to address the Muslim and the Arab world. And this is actually what I use with President Trump. I said, for the first time ever, Arab Americans and Muslim Americans are making a difference in this election. So you have to address them. You have to talk to them, especially they were so dissatisfied with the Biden and Harris administration vis-a-vis the war in Gaza. They wanted arms embargo and they wanted the ceasefire.
Before we roll the cameras, we established that you've been doing this for a long time because you started at the age of 5 as
More
a
or
child
less.
reporter. No, but what I was going to talk about is how important it is to build these relationships over the years, and that's one of the key things you've had to do, being the bureau chief here.
Absolutely, because Washington is a revolving door. And my advice to all journalists who are starting, always maintain good relationship with everybody who comes to the White House and leaves the White House, because you never know when they're going to come back. So, but it's hard because now we have a new administration. So I no longer know who's going to be in the White House, who's going to be in the Oval Office, who's going to be in the National Security Council, who's going to be in the press office. So you have to build relationship from zero and you have to maintain them. But experience helps, obviously, if you know there is part of the system is still there. So especially with career diplomats that you know them over the years.
Having seen these twists and turns over 6 elections, would you expect a return to the race at some point by Kamala Harris?
I don't think so, because if you remember during the primaries in the first election, she was the first to exit. She didn't do well. And President Biden became the nominee of the party. People think that maybe she's not qualified enough to deal with in this election, in this cycle of this election. So I don't know. Everybody says, and this is like conventional wisdom in Washington, if the U.S. is going to elect a woman, it's going to be a conservative woman. It's going to be a Republican woman, not a Democratic woman.
What are your expectations from the next Trump presidency? What happens next year when he's back in the Oval Office?
There's lots of anticipation, actually. We don't know, but from what I gathered so far, it's going to be slightly different. He learned from the first term. Now people, and especially American media, they're focusing on loyalty, that he's going to bring people who are loyal to him but not qualified. But the fact that he appointed the first woman in U.S. history to be chief of staff at the White House, Susie Wiles, it speaks volume to where he's heading. It doesn't mean that it will apply to other people, but and we will see if actually he will carry on with this agenda. He said that on day one he's going to do the biggest deportation in the U.S. history, and this is not easy. And we know that many presidents on the campaign trail, they give us so many promises, but when they come and they see the reality, I mean, people say it might cost $88 billion to do that. And, you know, where are you going to round out all these millions of illegal immigrants? So it's a tough job. And also with the taxes as well, the tariff on taxes that might affect the middle class, the deficit in the budget is massive. So there's lots of challenges for sure. And for us, what concerns us in the Middle East is the wars. He told me that he's going to stop the war in Gaza and Lebanon. He's against the killing of civilians. And we will see if he's able to do that and do it pretty quickly.
Are you confident there may be some steps, different steps this time?
It will be, because I believe that the relationship between this current administration and the Israeli Prime Minister was not good. Basically, this is an administration that gave everything that Netanyahu wanted. They provided them with weapons that no other administration did, and in return they got nothing. So they didn't have any leverage. So Netanyahu, and everybody knows, he was waiting for the president to leave, and he was waiting for the results to act. So with President Trump, or President-elect Trump, we know that he's pro-Israel. He says that. He did that in the previous administration. He recognized Jerusalem as a capital of Israel. He moved the embassy. He recognized the Golan Heights as part of Israel, etc. But I think because he has this personality, if Netanyahu defy him in something, he will be very upset with that, and he cannot do this. So he projects power and he projects strength, and I think that will apply to Putin and Netanyahu.
I was going to ask about Vladimir Putin because, you know, in his previous administration, there were issues about his relationship with the Russian government, the Russian leader.
Absolutely. And he says, again, in this interview that he gave me almost 2 weeks before the election, he said that I'm going to stop the war in Ukraine. And people say, well, how is he going to do that? And it was explained to me many times through his circle that basically, if you have a conflict, you have to be able to call both sides of the on both sides of the conflict. And this administration were unable, of course, to call President Putin after President Biden called him a dictator, is a war criminal, etc. So the relationship and the diplomatic relationship was cut off. So, I mean, they still have an embassy representation, but I mean, in terms of making a difference in the negotiation or stopping the war. So they believe that he might be able to do something, but it has to be a tough deal and compromise, and, you know, maybe having an agreement that Ukraine will not join NATO for 20 years, as we heard, or putting some troops in no man's land, or it has to be something worked out.
While I've got you, I'm going to pick your brains a little bit on the relationship, how it might change with China.
Again, with China, he's been tough, and he's been accused China of spreading the coronavirus. He even used, some people say, a language that's not acceptable, of call it the Chinese virus, etc. But his relationship again with Xi Jinping is much better than President Biden's relationship. And I think world leaders look at him, although the media like to say, well, the whole world is really, really worried about the Trump presidency. I think he's able to do certain deals. Now, we'll see. He promised that he's going to put tough tariffs on China. Whether that will be carried through or not, we will see. But at least the leaders see them eye to eye. And remember last term, he invited him to Mar-a-Lago. So he built this relationship with certain leaders that in the end, maybe it have some results. And we've seen that with Kim Jong-un, who goes to the no man's land and stand there. Exactly. And then speak with him. So I think some people think it's not a naive foreign policy and lacks the nuances and sophistication. But he says, look at the results. At my time, there were no wars, and the economy was flourishing in the U.S. Of course, this is a simple way of looking at it. There's so many other variables. But at least people expect that his relationship with China, with Russia, with the rest of the Arab world, he wants also to expand on the Abraham Accords. He wants to bring peace because he believed that war cannot be beneficial to anybody, and especially the reflection on the U.S. citizen in terms of energy prices and gas prices at the pumps.
Nadia, you and I are sitting out on a very unusual November day.
Absolutely.
It's warm. And the streets around the White House, which we're overlooking, it's peaceful.
Yes.
You did a story on what was expected to happen if things didn't go well. Tell me about that.
We expected always that it might be some violence around, and it's normal for the White House to be surrounded by, wooden boards and whatever, because they prepare for January 20th of January, which is the day that the U.S. celebrate the new president in the inauguration day. We will see him walking from here, the motorcade from the Capitol going to the White House. But all what we have seen in terms of high fencing all around Lafayette Park, the other side of the White House, this is unusual because everybody thought it might be some violence, but they expected if Trump loses, not if he wins. So
they even boarded up the shops.
Oh, absolutely, because during summer after George Floyd killing, or death. There was so much violence for 3 months almost in the summer. So all the statues, which is historical statues, were smashed. Everything here the shops were looted. So this is why it's anticipation of violence. But let's hope that nothing's going to happen. It's going to be a peaceful transition to power, as the White House promised, and everything will go smoothly.
It looks like it. That such a decisive victory has taken the wind out of the sails of any protesters.
Oh, completely,
Yeah.
completely. I mean, I was shocked, not just, as I said to you, the whole country was shocked. I was shocked actually to see California. I was looking at the map of California, and it's a comparison between 2020 and 2024. Apart from the coastal area, California is red. I mean, what does it say? The whole country is moving towards, I mean, this is probably another program for you to examine what happened in the US election.
Well, you know, you've got an interesting 4 years ahead as you
Oh, for
continue
sure.
here as the bureau chief. So good to have time with you, and I look forward to your next interview with President Trump.
Thank you so much.
Nadira Tudor, thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Well, we're going to end this episode in poetic fashion, as my executive producer, Neil Curry, has been reflecting on the aftermath of the elections and hopes of healing division. And where better to do that than at the Capitol Reflecting Pool in Washington, where he composed a poem entitled Election Reflections.
November in Washington, just 1 week on from an impact whose dusty cloud darkened the sun in the eyes of those seeking a different outcome. While the victors, elated in joy, celebrated, the change long awaited had finally come. In the hours before the decision is made, for some the hopes rise, yet for others they fade. Jubilation, sensation, salvation and cheers, tribulation, trepidation, frustration and tears. A zero-sum game for the forthcoming years. Election officials, the target of ire, conducted their counting behind the barbed wire. With careful precision, the electoral decision, uncontested, accepted, and free from derision, enabled the hopes of a tranquil transition. The jubilant victors soon take to the stage. The defeated, depleted walk home without rage. Half the nation elated, the other depressed, but no riots amounted, no signs of unrest. Democracy, questioned, yet rose to the test. Pathologists sharpen political tools. Post-mortems begin by the usual rules. Pondering pundits with scapegoats to seize. Panelists, pollsters now sink to their knees, while Lichtman considers his new tarnished keys. World leaders are queuing to bend at the knee. To honor the victor, not all could foresee. Renewing old friendships, regretting misdeeds, offering to service the president's needs. Past insults erased, for forgiveness they plead. Will promises made equal promises kept? Will political rivals be shown some respect? Belligerent language softened and sealed. Salvation, moderation, return to the field. Can a nation divided be finally healed? Washingtonian dogs still need to be walked. Political chatter still needs to be talked. Coffee brewed up and scrambled eggs downed. On the National Mall there are leaves to be browned and cover the Capitol's historic ground. And the sun still shines on the Capitol pool, glinting eyes squinting like some precious jewel. The ripples now calming, disarming some fears of the journey ahead to the forthcoming years. The tsunami receding, for now, it appears.
And that brings us to the end of this special edition from Washington, D.C., where preparations are underway for Donald Trump's presidential inauguration on January the 20th. But from me, Riz Khan, and the team in the U.S. Capitol, thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's show, Donald Trump announces Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as his nominee for Health Secretary, an anti-vaxxer whose views have sparked concerns from some in the scientific community. Plus, we're going to be diving into the future of the Middle East under Donald Trump. What's in store for the region as he assembles his cabinet and charts his next moves? And a bad day for Big Pharma. That's how some Republicans have described RFK Jr.'s appointment. Shares in large pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer have fallen on this news. Hello and welcome. The US President-elect Donald Trump has picked Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to lead the Department of Health and Human Services. Well, Kennedy has been accused of spewing controversial claims about vaccines at the height of the COVID-19 crisis and for opposing restrictions imposed during the pandemic. Well, he continues to bear the brunt of his claims, in particular his claim that vaccines are linked to autism. Well, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. ran for president in this year's election as an independent before dropping out in August. He then endorsed Trump in exchange for a role in the Republican administration. Well, as the new lead in Trump's health department, he says, quote, all of his policies are going to be science-based with the best science that's available.
I'm going to require, and first of all, anybody who wants to take a vaccine, I'm not going to get in their way. If you want a vaccine, or if you want to vaccinate your children, those vaccines will be available. But I am going to tell the truth to Americans, and I'm going to do for the first time good science, right? When I was a kid, there were 3 vaccines. Today, there are 72, and we're going up to now, I think, 77 or 79 with the annual COVID vaccines. So, and not one of those vaccines, with the exception of the COVID vaccine, not one of those vaccines has been tested prior to licensure. So what I would do as president is I would require placebo-controlled trials, long-term safety trials that will look at efficacy, will look at safety, will look at the long-term impacts and be able to inform Americans.
Well, let's get more now, and we can speak to Jan Halper-Hayes, who is a former member of President Trump's White House transition team. Jan, it's great to have you back with us here on Al Arabiya News. I'd like to talk to you about these latest nominees, in particular the nominee for Health Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Apparently he's going to make America healthy again. How's he going to do that?
Well, it's important to look at his position. He actually wrote a book that came out a couple of years ago that exposed our FDA and the CDC and the area that Fauci runs. And people need to understand that Fauci is a eugenist. And he has had a budget that has been so huge that he has had power over any epidemiologists, any researchers all over the world. And Robert Kennedy Jr. has seen through all of that. He has looked at the number of vaccines. Our babies get 76 vaccines. It's just not necessary for that to happen. But also, what happens is the pharmaceutical companies are the ones that fund our Federal Drug Administration. So he is going to clean up a lot of the corruption that goes on and focus on our foods that don't have GMO, that don't have the pesticides. It's very exciting. He understands it so incredibly well. There couldn't be anyone better to be that Health and Human Services Secretary.
Yeah, but difficult to understand why the scientific community is so up in arms about this. I mean, I've got a list of quotes with regards to this appointment that is extremely long. I couldn't possibly read them all out. The reaction from the Democrats is fairly predictable. They say he's dangerous, unqualified and unserious. But when it comes to the scientific community, for example, Professor John Joe McFadden at University of Surrey, who says this nomination demonstrates his disregard for science, he's talking about Donald Trump here, in favor of pseudoscience, misinformation and conspiracy theories. If confirmed, the policies he advocates will be a disaster, particularly for America. I mean, there's so many people to choose from in terms of finding criticism of this appointment. You're still sure he's the right man for the job. Why?
Well, it would be good if you got Dr. Mikovits or Dr. Peter McCullough, who can give you the other side of the science. The thing is that it is really the pharmaceutical community that funds all of this and drives the amount of drugs that we take. And yes, there have been scientific studies, and some of it Robert F. Kennedy considers very valid. But the fact is that it came out in Pfizer's documents that by December 2020, they knew that the vaccine would not prevent COVID. He has done research and he has exposed these people. Now, a lot of people have been bought. You really have to factor that in. Their livelihood comes from the corporate side of it. And so, yes, they don't like what he's saying because he's bringing out the truth behind a lot of, frankly, some fake peer review articles that have allowed for things to happen.
But, I mean, when it comes to his scientific background, I mean, is he really qualified to dish out opinions about vaccines at the height of a pandemic? I mean, was that a helpful thing for him to have done when, you know, there are plenty of scientists and plenty of large pharmaceutical organizations that ultimately put a stop to the pandemic, and we've moved on from the pandemic. I mean, they didn't do such a bad job, did they?
Well, actually, the COVID-1 was created and proven and patented in 2002 by Ralph Barrick out of the University of North Carolina, proving it could infect human lungs. And the SARS-CoV-19 was just an outgrowth of that, and Fauci had funded that. But let's back up a minute. A leader doesn't necessarily have to have the competence of their team. So he can know what the issues are. He can decide on the direction. He can see through the false scientific articles and the valid ones, and he can put the right people on to do the right thing.
But his education is primarily in law. What makes him qualified to call out scientists?
Well, everyone needs to see or look up his book, where he exposed Fauci and all of these health problems. You know, someone can be an incredible researcher over 20 years of being fascinated by it and have all this information and be able to communicate about it. So if anyone wants to discredit him, they're going to have a very difficult time because his knowledge base is so huge and thorough that people will have a hard time going up against him.
Indeed. Well, his scientific credentials are perhaps what's worrying many in the scientific community. But just moving on, I mean, the comments he's made, aren't you worried that, for example, his comments on vaccines could result in greater vaccine hesitancy amongst people in the United States? And that could have real health implications for adults as well as children, and in particular for children.
Well, I think what he wants to do is pare it down to the most relevant vaccines. Why do babies need 76 vaccines?
Good question, but that's something that scientists have decided, doctors have decided. It's a relevant question, but why does it have to be RFK Jr. who has the answer?
Sorry, it makes money for the pharmaceutical companies. Look, when my kid was in daycare and someone came down with the measles, the pediatrician said, get him there, because if he gets the measles, he will become immune to it. Even Fauci has said that when people got COVID and weren't vaccinated, they became immune. We've gotten so far away from natural remedies of people survived without all of these vaccines. And I don't think that making it a big worry and giving the side to the quote unquote scientific, you need to wait, because this is going to get exposed big time.
Okay, well, let's move on to some of the things he might do whilst he's in office. He says he's going to purge the Food and Drug Administration, better known by its acronym, the FDA. Why does that need to happen?
Well, let's see. When it came to the Pfizer documents, Dr. Robert Malone, who was the inventor of the mRNA and said no one should have that in a vaccine, but Pfizer and the FDA were going to seal all the documents for 75 years. Dr. Malone went to court, we got the documents, and we were able to find what they were trying to hide. The damage to pregnant women, the number of deaths, the improper control groups to test the validity of it. So the FDA is paid by the pharmaceutical companies. And often what happens is when they leave the FDA, they go work for the pharmaceutical companies.
But the FDA has got a reputation around the world as being perhaps the most prominent reference point for regulation and for standards. And isn't there a risk that if Kennedy damages its reputation, I mean, he's damaging the entire American scientific community, isn't he?
Well, I wouldn't go that far, because just because he shows what the problems are, what they've done wrong, they're also going to be doing a lot of things right. Just because there's criticism, it doesn't mean that there won't be good things done. And he won't be, and the fact is he'll be quite right about the actions that he's taking.
So what do you think he's planning to do then, concretely, to tackle it?
Well, I think he's going to investigate exactly why they have approved certain things. He's going to start there. He's going to find out who is making money on the side. And he is going to set it up a different kind of relationship, not where the pharmaceutical companies can pay the people of the FDA, but the FDA is focused on the safety of the people of the nation.
Okay, just looking at the sort of the general appointments across the board, just more generally speaking, you know, the ones that have been announced in the last few days, a flurry of appointments for this new administration. What are your thoughts? Do any of them, I mean, do you think it's fair to say, first of all, with RFK, that he's perhaps the most controversial of all of them so far?
I think if you talk to them, they don't like the idea that Matt Gaetz is going to be the Attorney General. Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. I think putting Tulsi Gabbard in for our spy agencies was one of the best things that Trump did. The fact that Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk, both very, very successful business people, are going to find a way that our government excels. It were two great appointments. He has asked the lunaticfarmer.com to be an advisor to the agriculture secretary so that we can bring about a better way of raising our food. He's he's shaking things up, things that have needed to be changed for years and years and years.
Sure. I mean, disruption seems to be a common theme with quite a lot of the people who've been announced in the last few days. But they've got to be qualified, haven't they, to do the job? And there have even been people from the Republican Party who've spoken to us on this channel and expressed serious concern about one or two of them. And you mentioned Matt Gaetz. Are you concerned about him?
Well, you have to understand how the Department of Justice has withheld or redacted documents that Congress has every right to oversee. Congress is basically each agency's boss because they set the laws and they approve things. I think Matt Gaetz, being the Attorney General, is going to dig in to the lawfare. He's going to dig into the relationship with the FBI and the CIA. And he will shake things up. He is a disruptor par excellence, and actually that's what's needed, especially after the lawfare that came out against Donald Trump.
Yeah, I mean, what happens next? Because when you've got people like Matt Gaetz and RFK Jr. That not everyone approves of by any stretch of the imagination, supposing they don't get confirmation from the Senate, there's something called a recess appointment, where I gather they can be sort of fast-tracked in or pushed into those positions. Just tell us a bit about how you see things unfolding.
Well, I think it's actually, we now have 53 senators. So in all probability, his picks will get confirmed. But using the recess appointments takes all of that out of it and allows people to get and do their job. I'm all for that, so that there are none of these games that go on. Look, there was someone who he wanted to be number 3 at the Department of Defense. And it turned out that 20 years before, the ex-wife had done something. And so the Democrats brought that up and rubbed it in his face. We don't need that kind of petty stuff going on.
Well, it happens on both sides of the aisle, doesn't it, when new administrations come in? And the whole point of having these great institutions is that they vet the candidates and make sure they can stand up to scrutiny. Surely that's the whole point.
Well, it is the whole point, but when we have both sides, and the Republicans aren't necessarily as petty as the Democrats, they scrutinize, but they tend to scrutinize with more facts and concerns, like when they asked the latest appointment to the Supreme Court, what is a woman? And she couldn't answer it. Well, that was very revealing to the country.
So when John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, says all options are on the table to clear Trump's nominees, just how do you interpret that? What do you think he means by that?
Well, I don't know, because Thune doesn't really like Trump. So we might see some jockeying going on.
Okay, but just for the record, you're happy with the announcement that RFK is going to be looking after health matters for you and millions of other Americans?
Absolutely. And the thing is that people are so quick to judge instead of waiting to see the actions he's going to take. And that is what Trump has put in there. People who will take action and deal with the problems that we've been aware of for decades and find ways to solve them. And that's what people need to be focusing on.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time today, Jan Halper-Hayes. Thank you very much indeed to you.
Thank you.
Well, staying with the news of the appointment of RFK Jr., we can speak now to the Executive Director of the American Public Health Association, George C. Benjamin. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. I'd just like to get your thoughts, first of all. How do you feel about having an anti-vaxxer having such a public and prominent role when it comes to health matters?
You know, we actually think this is the wrong guy for the job. He doesn't have the medical training, the management skills to manage such a large enterprise, the temperament, and his many of his public statements have resulted in the fact that he doesn't have people's trust to run this kind of agency.
Okay, so obviously you don't feel a huge amount of confidence. And of course, you've worked already with the Trump administration during the last term. Just tell us a bit about how that relationship works. Do they often come to you and ask for advice?
Well, I've been personally in D.C. for a long time, and I've been a local health officer in this region. And so, yeah, I've worked with administrations of both Democrats and Republicans. And I've been on advisory committees, and as my association, which is, you know, the largest public health association in America, we've been around since 1872. We do advise the federal government in a variety of ways, either directly or indirectly. And we've worked with the Trump administration in the past. They've had some extraordinarily competent people to work with. We did have to work with them during COVID because, you know, COVID was a big event, like it was everywhere else. And we had things that went real well, but we also had some things that did not go well when people who were not qualified got into the fray.
And do you imagine that you, in your capacity as Executive Director of American Public Health, you will have to work closely with RFK Jr.?
I'm going to have to work closely with the department. Obviously, the secretary has to decide who he wants to listen to, but I'm certainly going to reach out to him should he be confirmed, just because I've worked with every other secretary and I've known every other secretary, you know, in the department since at least 1990.
A lot of shock from the scientific community about RFK being given this role, given in particular his anti-vax stance. But when it comes to business and how he runs the department under his control, I mean, he seems to suggest there's a lot of wastage, there's a lot of corruption, and there's a need for much greater transparency. Do you think he's got a point?
You know, every organization can improve in its efficiency. And, you know, most of his statements are absolutely overstated. The organization has got highly competent people, and can things be improved? Absolutely. But the Food and Drug Administration, the CDC, as entities that he's specifically targeted, are terribly underfunded. If the truth be shown, and we know that they're terribly underfunded.
And he's issued this message on X telling people in the FDA, saying they're part of a corrupt system. I've got two messages for you: preserve your records and pack your bags. I mean, do you feel threatened by that?
You know, if I was an employee, absolutely, I would feel threatened. You know, many of these people can make a lot more money in the private sector without the kind of threats. They enjoy what they do. They've committed to public service, and that's not the way you treat public servants.
What do you make of some of Kennedy's theories? He's got a theory, I gather, about removing fluoride from drinking water, for example. What's the science behind that, do you think?
We know that fluoride is safe and effective in the doses that are delivered. Primarily, people used to get their fluoride in their drinking water. They now can get fluoride in a variety of other ways, including toothpaste, specialized treatments when you go to the dentist's office. But I got to tell you, there are a lot of people that don't go to the dentist's office. There are a lot of people that don't drink water out of the tap. There are a lot of people that still drink water that comes out of wells. So fluoride in the drinking water and professional water systems is very important. Can you be given too much of anything? Absolutely. Anything that's therapeutic, you can get too much of. So to the extent that use of fluoride over time might change, there's no reason not to have a national conversation about it. But his theories and the way he's articulated them are not helpful to the conversation.
But clearly America does face a number of health issues, major concerns, the opioid crisis, the There's obviously an issue with regards to nutrition and obesity in the United States. Don't you think it's a good thing that someone with a totally fresh perspective and a totally different set of ideas should come in and perhaps look at some of these historic problems in a different way?
Every administration has new people with new ideas and new ideas. He's not unique there. Yes, there's obesity problem, an obesity epidemic, opioid epidemic, a gun violence epidemic, a epidemic of maternal child health. Maternal mortality is high in the United States, growing STDs. Healthcare costs are going through the roof. So he's got a lot of things he's going to walk into that are going to occupy his time on day one, none of which he has any skill, expertise, or training to manage.
Okay, so you clearly don't think he's the right man for the job. But, I mean, when it comes to the FDA and looking at nutrition and what people eat in America, I mean, he does seem to have some reasonable points, doesn't he? I mean, when you look at the correlation between various health issues in the United States and the sorts of things people are eating, I mean, he's as qualified as anyone to see that there's a problem and to try and fix it, isn't he?
Well, I'd be happy to have him try to fix it. The FDA has been trying to fix the same problem he's articulating for many, many years. So if he can aid in that, great. But, you know, this is not something that he can come in by fiat and change overnight. And in fact, the very people that he's demonizing are the very people that he's going to need to help him make any changes that he's proposing. And by the way, you know, the biggest problem in America, even though I would agree, high fat, high salt, low nutritious foods are a problem. Obesity certainly is a problem. You're looking at a guy who struggled to keep my weight down my whole adult life. But having said that, the biggest problem we have in America is food insecurity. That's a problem the health department needs to take on with vengeance. He can also make sure that people have in our schools nutritious lunches. And yeah, we need a champion for nutritious lunches in the schools. So if he articulates everybody having access to affordable, safe food, nutritious lunches, and kids are able to get those lunches in school that they need, that they can't get at home, we're all for it and we'll work with him on that. If he goes in and says, you people are bad and we're going to, by fiat, try to change the rules, he's going to be a failure. It's not that we're going to necessarily be the group that's opposing to him, but he won't have if he doesn't have the industry to help him do this, he won't be successful.
Yeah, I mean, I've been looking at reaction to the news of RFK Jr.'s nomination, lots of it, and it comes from all corners of the globe. I just found this from Professor Simon Wesley at King's College London. He's a professor of psychiatry, and he says, quote, that sound you just heard was my jaw dropping, hitting the floor and rolling out of the door. As someone who graduated from a Texas high school, I have a great admiration and affection for Americans. They deserve better, much better than this. Who do you think would have been a better choice than RFK Jr. as Donald Trump's pick to head up this important role?
Yeah, I'd be the one to condemn anybody that would name. But let me just say that the Republican Party has a deep, long, highly qualified bench. Just look at many of the people that were in their last administration. Several of them would be excellent secretaries. Look at people that have been in previous Republican administrations. Many of them can be excellent secretaries. This is just not the guy for the job. Had they put in someone who was properly trained, with the management skills and experience, with the temperament, and could develop the trust of the American people, we would all be for him. And by the way, we supported many of the Trump administration appointees the last time in the health department.
Yeah, I mean, some people have gone much further than the person that I just quoted there, the professor I quoted there. Others in the political realm have called RFK Jr.'s appointment dangerous, unqualified, unserious, they've said. And I'm just wondering, lastly, whether you think perhaps his appointment threatens to undermine America's position as a reference point and a center of excellence for the global scientific community.
The secretary is our buzzman to the world, and I don't know how you take him seriously because we don't.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. George C. Benjamin, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, for more, we can cross to Washington now and speak to Reed Gallen, who is a former Republican strategist for George W. Bush, John McCain, and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Reed, you're also the host of the Homefront podcast, which focuses on U.S. democracy, as does the Lincoln Project, which you co-founded. Great to have you with us. Now, Donald Trump, President-elect, has announced his nominee for Health Secretary, RFK Jr. I just want to get your opinion. What does this appointment mean for the health of the American people?
Well, for the health of the American people, I think it means that there are a lot of diseases that we probably eradicated that are likely to come back. This is as much symbolic as it is operational. The Department of Health and Human Services, which I worked at more than 20 years ago, is an enormous, sprawling organization. It comprises tens of thousands of people, several different buildings in different places. And so I think this is one where if Robert Kennedy Jr. wants to go in and cause trouble, I certainly think he can, but is one where there are so many people buried so deeply into the American democracy that it's going to take him a little while to really start to make the changes I think he thinks he can make.
I mean, obviously his appointment is like quite a lot of the other Trump appointments for this next administration. A disruptor, I think, is one of the words that's being used to describe RFK Jr., and that's being used to describe some of the others. I mean, surely there's an argument that a disruptor in a huge department like the one you've just described could actually be quite a good thing.
I would say this is that, you know, one of the issues we have, I think, not only in the United States, but in many places that consider themselves to be democratic in nature, is that you have to have a common argument about what we're all looking to do and what we all agree needs to be done. And I think, yeah, you're right. Disruption can be a positive force when it's aimed at being a positive force. Now, I think that Kennedy probably believes that his brand of disruption and chaos will be good for the American people. But it seems to me like most of these picks, they're purely ideological in nature. He has been willing to truck with many conspiracy theories, most of them around vaccines. Most of them are not proven. And so I think the idea now that someone here who has less, first and foremost, no medical training whatsoever, but certainly has a perspective on what he thinks should be the focus of overall health in the United States, I think is a little bit concerning. Again, the concept of disruption in and of itself, I think, could be very healthy. I think in this particular case, this is a place where you have to understand what it does, because it does a lot of things other than just, say, the health department. And from my perspective, he is unlikely to be helpful in the context of American health, as opposed to harmful based on whatever conspiracy theory he believes that day.
But he, like a lot of Americans, mistrust what is known now as big pharma and big food, you know, these huge industries that make trillions of dollars every year. And RFK Jr. accuses the FDA, for example, of pandering to those kind of agencies. Do you think his appointment could perhaps conversely restore public trust in the agency?
I think him restoring public trust is problematic because, remember, he's not normal. This is not a normal individual. He cannot help but be who he is. Now, let me say this on whether that's big food or big pharma. If he really is willing to take those on, I'd be fascinated to see what that looks like. But from my perspective, if the difference between getting something done and making sure that, let's say, a big pharmaceutical company panders to the Trump administration in the context of benefiting Donald Trump and the people around him, I would venture to say that big pharma is going to be just fine, and Bobby Kennedy can rail against, you know, big food, big sugar, all that he wants. I think those are important conversations to have. Unfortunately, I don't think this is the administration that, if it's willing to be paid off, and I use that word intentionally, will do anything, you know, on behalf of, quote unquote, the little guy.
But I mean, when you look at the appointments more broadly of the new Trump administration, all these people labeled as disruptors, I mean, they are what you're going to get. I mean, that's what this whole administration is going to be about. And isn't it worth, therefore, looking at them as being a group of people who are going to have a very different approach to everything that needs to be tackled in the United States, whether it's the wars in faraway countries, whether it's the economy, and in this case, whether it's the health of Americans. I mean, isn't it a good thing for a democracy to have a totally fresh pair of eyes and a totally fresh approach to some historical problems?
I would say that, again, we should differentiate the difference between disruption as a good thing and disruption as a goal. And also that just because something is different doesn't necessarily make it better. Do I think the federal bureaucracy here in the U.S. needs a lot of work? I certainly do. Do I believe that the people that Donald Trump is choosing are there for that purpose? I don't. I think that they are there to carry out whatever orders Donald Trump and the people immediately around him are asking them to do. And so from my perspective, I would say this is that very few of these people have earned the benefit of the doubt. And so from my perspective, I would say don't trust very much, but verify what it is they're going to do. And, you know, the burden of proof is on them, not on the American people.
More than 140 million Americans are beneficiaries of government-funded health insurance. Do you think RFK Jr.'s appointment is going to mean significant change for them?
I think that's a question that has as much to do with the now fully Republican Congress that will take office here in just a few weeks, as it does with the Health and Human Services Department. A lot of the government-funded programs are legislated; they're not, and then administrated by a particular agency. So I would venture to say that if they want to get rid of the the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, as it's often called, they'll have to do that legislatively, and then they will have to go through the administrative process of telling however many millions of Americans, congratulations, you no longer have health insurance, which I think will be broadly unpopular.
And when it comes to the pharmaceutical companies themselves, we've seen shares in vaccine makers like Pfizer falling after the news of RFK Jr.'s appointment. I mean, do you think they're genuinely worried?
I think they should be worried, not so much because that RFK or anybody will do anything overt, at least early on, but because they will make it much more difficult to probably get anything approved. And if you are Pfizer or any of these other companies who have put years and years and years of investment into something, you've done trials, you've gone to the Food and Drug Administration to try and get something approved, and now you don't think it's going to get approved, then you could see, millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of research and development down the drain. So I would say is almost as much troubling for them as what they won't be able to get done is what they're already doing.
Kennedy, of course, ran for president as an independent earlier this year before dropping out and endorsing Trump. I'm just wondering, what do you think is the nature of the relationship between the two men? Do they get on?
I think they do. I think they see in one another kindred spirits. They are both, as I've never met Kennedy, but as I understand it, they're both very charismatic in their own way. They both have an ability to appeal to a group of folks and create a very strong bond with them. And I think that for Trump, this is also important because remember that a good deal of his base is anti-vaccine, does not believe that COVID was real, that the COVID vaccine was bad. Bobby Kennedy wholly believes that as well. Donald Trump is on the other hand was vaccinated many times, probably even up to this moment. And so this is also a political play for Donald Trump, which is appealing to a lot of people who you mentioned. It's not just distrust in big pharma or big food or even the government, but just in everything.
Is it dangerous, do you think, for a political party, the Republican Party, to have enemies in the form of big pharma and big food? Looking ahead, this is, of course, to the midterms in just 2 years from now and to the next presidential election. I mean, how powerful are these institutions?
Well, I think we'll see. I think that's the real point is if, let's say that pharma, which is also a trade association made up of all the big pharmaceutical companies, decides to start dumping tens or hundreds of $1 million into political races, what punitive action does, let's say, Robert Kennedy or the Trump administration take against those companies for doing that? And as we've seen with the Supreme Court decision of the summer of 2024, anything the Trump administration does is an official act, is covered, under presidential immunity, for lack of a better way to put it. So I think that they will be cautious. But, look, they have billions and billions of dollars on the table, and it will remain to be seen whether or not they're willing to take Trump on when, frankly, so many people haven't.
I mean, the Department of Health is just one department that's in for a massive shake-up. But when you listen to what RFK said a little while ago, he said to people in the Department of Health, pack your bags and keep records, because, I mean, it sounds to me as though he's threatening to go after them. I mean, there's a slightly recurrent theme here, isn't there, of new people going into all these departments and really shaking things up with some veiled threats, it would appear.
I don't even know that they're that veiled. If you tell somebody to pack their bags, I think you've just threatened them, veiled or otherwise. This goes back to the idea of something that they tried to do at the end of the first administration called Schedule F, which is a significant reduction in the federal workforce, a reduction in the bureaucracy here in the United States. This is something they said they're going to do. I don't doubt that to the extent that they can do it, they will do it. Because remember, too, that they're not worried about if there's a particular program officer who has an expertise in something. They're not worried about whether or not that person sits there because they don't care about the program in the first place. It is really about, as you said, a reduction in force and then a replacement with loyalists and ideologues.
Yeah, but they're going to run into a difficulty here, aren't they? Because, if you start laying off people en masse and then you've got far-reaching programs like the mass deportation of up to 1 million people, and you haven't got the manpower, and they're just not even going to have the time to recruit the manpower to carry some of this, to carry through some of these policies. It sounds like a lot of things aren't very carefully thought through. Does that strike you?
Well, I would say this is that the one group of people who you have not heard about being, the force reduction is federal law enforcement. Whether or not it's the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, the FBI. Remember, there are many, many federal law enforcement agencies, and they will be utilized for things like mass deportation if that happens, which I hope it does not. But you will also see that if the federal government believes it needs to either employ the National Guard in a given state or deputize state and local law enforcement officers to assist with these things, that's what they'll do. So, the Schedule F, the reduction in bureaucracy, I think will notably not take federal law enforcement to task on its numbers.
Okay, and just lastly, I mean, what happens next? I mean, these nominees are, that's one thing, to nominate someone for a position. For them to get through Senate approval is another. Do you think people like RFK and perhaps Matt Gaetz, some of the more controversial nominees, will actually make it through that process and actually be installed?
I mean, that remains to be seen. There are several ways that the Trump administration can do this, which is they can make what's called a recess appointment, which is if the Senate decides to go into recess for any number of reasons, let's say President's Day or Easter, then the president can appoint those people while they're gone for basically a year. But again, as we saw in the first administration, we should not assume that they're going to care about any of that. This is also, I think, very importantly, it's a good point you raised, which is this is a purity test. There are going to be 53 Republican senators, each of whom will be expected to approve these people. Now, there's been a couple of United States senators, Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, Susan Collins from Maine, who have already said that they would say no to a Matt Gaetz. But we should assume that now, like the rest of the ethos of the Trump organization, that those people will face enormous political pressure back home. Susan Collins is up for re-election in 2026. And remember that for a lot of MAGA, they would rather see an unloyal Republican lose, right, and have a Democrat than have, someone who's disloyal to the cause sit there and cause trouble. And so I would say this is it remains to be seen. I think that, you've seen some glimmers that the United States Senate wants to maintain its constitutional authority. But I think that they will have to decide which of these people they can suitably, say, no, Mr. President, you can't have that. But it can only be one or two of them. They're not going to be able to say no to everybody.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. We're going to have to leave it there. Reid Gallen, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks.
Moving on now, the future of the Middle East under President-elect Donald Trump still remains unclear, but analysts suggest that his nomination of Mike Huckabee as US ambassador to Israel may offer some clues. Well, Huckabee, a former Arkansas governor, has previously dismissed the notion of a Palestinian identity, aligning with right-wing Israeli politicians who view his appointment as a sign of continued US support, particularly in the West Bank. However, while Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital in 2017, he did also maintain strong ties with Arab leaders and has repeatedly pledged to end the war in Gaza. So what will Trump's approach be when it comes to the region? Well, to discuss this further, I'm joined now by PJ Crowley, former US Assistant Secretary of State under President Barack Obama. Thank you so much for being with us here on Al Arabiya News, PJ. Just before we talk about international affairs and foreign policy, I just wanted to ask you about this flurry of announcements in the last couple of days, in particular the appointment of RFK Jr. as to head up the health department. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's outrageous on its face to put a vaccine skeptic in charge of the Department of Health and Human Services with responsibility for oversight of the National Institutes of Health. I think it's important to remember that, Donald Trump is much more interested in making bold statements than actually governing. But ultimately, all of these nominations, including Robert Kennedy Jr., are subject to Senate confirmation. So he'll nominate him formally, but the Senate, should get the last word on this.
Okay, let's turn our attention now to national security. Donald Trump is going to inherit quite a series of global crises, not to mention the war in Ukraine, Gaza, escalating worries about the alliance between Russia and North Korea. A lot of the people in the new Team Trump are labeled as disruptors. And I'm wondering whether you think that could be a good thing when it comes to fresh perspective on some now getting quite old problems.
Well, I think, first of all, it is clear that the world, including the Middle East, is far more complex today than it was when he left office 4 years ago. So he will inherit an active Middle East conflict, with multiple dimensions across Gaza, Lebanon, the Gulf, and the Houthis. Piecing this together into a coherent problem will be a challenge for any incoming administration. Marco Rubio, the prospective Secretary of State, is knowledgeable and skilled in international affairs. The question will be what kind of influence he'll have on Donald Trump going forward. That remains to be seen.
Yeah, Marco Rubio is the first time that a Secretary of State has got Latino heritage. I mean, that could be a good thing, couldn't it, with regards to relations with Latin America. He's also a fervent supporter of Israel, isn't he?
Well, Donald Trump in his first term, was a fervent supporter of Israel. He did some very noteworthy things. The Abraham Accords, are very significant. Clearly he will try, like the Biden administration has, to try to, thread this very difficult needle, across the pursuit of Palestinian statehood and normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, most notably. He's going to have to adapt. If the Saudi Arabia position is, we're not going to go forward with any talks on normalization unless there's a clear path forward towards Palestinian statehood, Trump will have his work cut out for him because the Netanyahu government is quite literally not constructed presently to make concessions on the Palestinian question. So this will represent a challenge for American diplomacy, and it will represent a challenge for Israeli governance.
And what do you make of the appointment of former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee as ambassador to Israel? I mean, that sends quite a message, doesn't it, to Israel?
Well, it remains to be seen. An ambassador is charged with improving the relationship between the United States, and the country in which he or she serves. So I think Mike Huckabee will be very well received, in Jerusalem. But Donald Trump has appointed a new Middle East envoy. That's not something that the Biden administration did. He's a deal maker, but the challenge will be, is there really at the end of the day, a deal to be made, between the Israelis and the Palestinians? There are clear obstacles on both sides of that equation, and that will be a very significant challenge. But obviously, first and foremost, it's to get a ceasefire in Gaza, and there are some indications that while Benjamin Netanyahu was not willing to do any favors for the Biden administration or the Harris administration, he may well be more flexible, at least in the short term, in reaching a ceasefire, in Gaza. That will be a very important first step.
So you don't rate the chances too highly of this outgoing administration, which has got, roughly 70 days left to run, of striking any deal in Gaza or perhaps in Lebanon either?
I'm reminded of 1980 and the transition from the Carter administration to the Reagan administration. Iran was holding hostages, and chose to wait till the Reagan administration was in place, before releasing them. They had a clear message they weren't going to do any favors for the Carter team, and I think we might be in that same situation where I think Netanyahu will be initially responsive, to Trump's efforts to reach a ceasefire, and like I say, that is a necessary step, but that doesn't necessarily mean, from a ceasefire, the prospect of negotiations. There's still questions about who will govern, Gaza and how, and the Netanyahu government has been very silent on that question. So getting to a ceasefire will be useful, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be movement forward towards an actual negotiation. Okay,
so it doesn't sound like you're too hopeful anything is going to happen in the next 70 days in the region. But what do you make of Donald Trump's claim, and he made this claim multiple times on the campaign trail, that he can end these wars that by just picking up the telephone to speak to whether it's Benjamin Netanyahu or the president of Russia with regards to the conflict in Ukraine? Do you think he's going to be able to deliver on that?
Well, he's at the end of the day, he's a deal maker. He prides himself in that. He defines himself, in that way. All well and good. But he thought there was a better Iran nuclear deal during his 4 years in office. That didn't happen. He thought there was the prospect of a deal between the United States and North Korea. That didn't happen. So ultimately, the details here matter. Whether we're talking about Ukraine, there's probably a deal to be made there, but it will be on terms that Vladimir Putin likes and Ukraine and Europe hate. So, is that a deal you actually want to make? And in the Middle East, the irony, the tragic irony here is that we've understood for 25 years, what the contours of an actual deal, a Middle East deal between the Palestinians and the Israelis, looks like. We know what it looks like, but we have not had the opportunity or particularly the political will on both sides at the same time, to make significant moves, towards an actual deal. And that's the very situation that Donald Trump will inherit, in January.
Just turning our attention more specifically to Ukraine, I mean, it does look like if there's a deal that's going to be made there, will be less favorable perhaps under Donald Trump than it would have been under the Biden administration, because let's face it, the National Security Advisor nominee, Mike Waltz, has not been too vocal in his support for aid for Ukraine, has he?
Well, I mean, this is where perhaps, Donald Trump can come in with a little bit of leverage. He's very skeptical about a blank check and the ongoing provision of arms to Ukraine. So he may well be prepared to lean into, Ukraine to be prepared to negotiate and at least achieve a temporary ceasefire, where you establish a temporary border, basically along the lines that exist now. The question is whether he has leverage, with Vladimir Putin. That remains to be seen. But critically important, if he's going to force Ukraine, to cede territory, at least in the short term, the real question is, what does Ukraine get in return for that? Whether it's a clearer path towards EU membership, a clearer path towards NATO membership, which is a red line for Putin. This is going to be highly complex and very emotionally charged on all sides, regardless of who's president, and we'll see whether Trump is up to the challenge.
One of the appointments we haven't talked about is Pete Hegseth, the former Fox News host, Army veteran. Some saying he's got a rather thin CV. What are your thoughts on his level of experience? Do you think he's got what it takes?
Well, he served in uniform. That has value, that has importance, but he's never been involved directly in national security or defense policymaking. Look, I served 26 years in the Air Force. I served 11 years at the Pentagon. It is a very big place. It's the largest bureaucracy in the world, and it is a management challenge for any Secretary of Defense. So if he survives the confirmation process, he's going to have his work cut out for him. To show that he's up to the task and to communicate that clearly to the 2 million people in uniform.
It's quite interesting to see how Russia interpreted his appointment. They suggested that Hegseth won't or can't do much for American power, and therefore that's a good thing for Russia. And they went on to talk about Donald Trump as, quote, a big baby who doesn't know how to work in a team. I'm just wondering how you think all of this is viewed by Russia and how you see relations between Washington and Moscow changing under this second Trump administration.
That remains to be seen. I mean, certainly he'll never admit it, but Vladimir Putin, was dreaming of Donald Trump, returning to the White House. Of course, Trump is famously enamored with Vladimir Putin, for very strange and unknown reasons. So I'm quite certain that Putin senses an opportunity to achieve his ends through negotiation, through flattery, through various means. We'll have to see. Remember back to the first Trump administration when Trump and Putin did get together in Helsinki. It was a disaster for Donald Trump. I think Putin looks forward to that moment. The question is whether that's something that Trump is going to want to do, and it could well happen, in the contours of some sort of high-level negotiation regarding Ukraine. But again, as we said at the outset, the world is far more complex than it was 4 years ago, and Donald Trump is not necessarily a detail guy. So the team that he's assembling is going to have its work cut out for it.
One of the big photo moments of the week was Donald Trump and the outgoing President Joe Biden sitting by the fire in the Oval Office, having what looked like a very cordial conversation. They talked for 2 hours, and there was talk amongst them both of this being a smooth transition. I just wondered what you made of that, watching it, because I'm assuming you've seen some close up, perhaps some from a distance, several transitions over the years. I mean, do you think Biden was right to afford Trump that courtesy and have him round to the White House, given that he didn't have the same thing happen to him? And do you think they managed to find some common ground, in particular on the issues relating to national security?
Well, I think it is the right thing to do. I thought President Biden sent the appropriate signal that he wants the transition to be smooth. It was not something that the Biden team was afforded 4 years ago. That's history. Now the question is, what will the context of the discussions that go on between the outgoing Biden team and the incoming Trump team? These are important discussions. I've gone through, two of them, one from outside government, one from inside government, and what a president and his team tell the incoming team is vitally important. I remember being on the White House staff during the Clinton administration, and President Clinton, even with the negotiation between, for Middle East peace, he told President Bush that a deal between Yasser Arafat and the Israeli government, the Barak government at the time, was not possible. That turned out, I think, to be a serious mistake. And President Bush eventually came back to Middle East negotiations after a hiatus of a couple of years. And that it set back the process, and maybe there were opportunities there that we did not seize upon, and we haven't been that close since. So I do think it's vitally important for the Biden team to help the Trump team understand what has changed over 4 years. And it's very important for the Trump team to listen and to heed whatever advice they receive.
Yeah, and it does look, doesn't it, like the Trump administration, the second one, has learnt some lessons since 2016, not least when you look at the appointments that have been announced, this flurry of appointments that we started talking about at the beginning. I mean, they're ahead of schedule, aren't they, compared to where they were in 2016? And it looks like they're on track to have a team in place for the start of the new administration. Do you think it's fair to say they've learned some lessons and they're better prepared now than they were before?
They didn't expect to win in 2016. So in this particular case, there was transition planning that had not occurred 8 years ago. I mean, the real challenge here is will they be listening to the out briefings that the Biden administration provides? These are all people who, in many cases, are well versed in conspiracy theories in terms of RFK Jr. Tabby Gabbard as the director of national intelligence. May or may not be in or out of her depth. So this is a team that is much more comfortable spouting things, than listening to things. So these are not institutionalists. They're probably people who will come in with an agenda, and so this transition is important. But whatever advice they receive, the question is: do they hear it? Do they take it in? And do they incorporate that into their planning? That's what transitions are for.
Okay, we'll have to wait and see. But thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. PJ Crowley, thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome, Tom.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching, and be sure to join us on Monday for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers